What happens when Sasuke entrusts his goal to his brother Naruto? Sasuke Uchiha gives Naruto his Sharingan after knowing he would not survive his injuries against Haku's Sharingan Naruto done correctly. Ahem. Before we begin, please comment down which country you are watching from. Let's begin. The world inside Haku's demonic ice mirrors had contracted into a microcosm of crystalline terror. The air was so cold it burned the lungs with each frantic breath, frosting the edges of Naruto's jumpsuit and glazing the cement of the unfinished bridge beneath their feet. The only sounds were the haunting echo of Haku's voice, the sharp hiss of Sunban cutting through frozen air, and the thunderous, distant percussion of Kakashi and Zabuza's duel, a world away. "He is fast, Naruto," Sasuke gritted out, his newly awakened Tsutomu Sharingan spinning wildly, a crimson pinwheel trying to track dozens of moving targets at once. Sweat beaded on his temple, freezing instantly. His movements, they're not just speed. He's phasing between the mirrors. "Then we break the mirrors," Naruto shouted, a kunai held in a white-knuckled grip. His own instincts, a primal, orange-hued chakra simmering just beneath his skin, screamed at him to move, to attack. "No time," Sasuke snapped, his eyes flickering. Incoming. Another hail of Sunban erupted from multiple mirrors at once. This was no random volley. It was a calculated pincer maneuver. Sasuke's Sharingan, pushed to its nascent limit, saw the pattern a fragment of a second before it was complete. A cluster of needles, glinting with deadly intent, was aimed not at him, but at a blind spot in Naruto's frantic defense. The space between his shoulder and neck, a strike meant to sever vital nerves. There was no thought, only action. A guttural cry tore from Sasuke's throat, not of pain, but of effort, as he threw his entire body into Naruto's side. The shove was brutal, sending the blonde stumbling away just as the Sunban whipped into the space he'd occupied. And into Sasuke. The impact was sickeningly soft. Two of the slender needles found their mark, burying themselves deep in the side of Sasuke's neck, perilously close to his carotid artery and spine. He didn't scream. A choked gasp escaped him, his eyes widening in shock before the Sharingan flickered and died, leaving only the dark, depthless onyx of the Uchiha. His legs buckled, and he collapsed to the cold cement with a heavy, final sound. "Sasuke!" Naruto's roar was raw, tearing from a place of pure, unadulterated terror. He scrambled to his friend's side, his hands hovering, unsure where to touch. The Sunban looked like vile, metallic feathers sprouting from his neck. Sasuke's face was pale, his breathing shallow and wet. Haku's form solidified in a mirror before them, the ANBU mask betraying no emotion. "He moved on instinct to protect you." The mellifluous voice held a note of genuine, sorrowful surprise. A beautiful, yet tragic, loyalty. "He will not feel the next one, I promise." Inside Naruto, something shattered. The careful, fragile dam holding back the bilious, red-hued chakra of the Nine Tails cracked. A surge of corrosive, alien energy flooded his system, hotter than any fireball jutsu. His vision tinged red at the edges. But before the fox could fully take the wheel, Sasuke's hand shot up, trembling violently, and clamped around Naruto's wrist. The grip was shockingly strong. In Naruto, Sasuke's voice was a wet whisper, bubbles of blood forming at the corner of his lips. His dark eyes, glazed with pain, found Naruto's panicked blue ones. In them, Naruto saw no fear of death, only a terrifying, focused resolve. With his other hand, Sasuke moved. It wasn't a gesture of pain or weakness. It was deliberate, precise, a final jutsu. His fingers wrapped around the two Sunban protruding from his neck. Naruto watched, horrified and mesmerized as Sasuke, without a flinch, pulled them free with a sickening, wet slide. Blood, dark and arterial, welled up and began to stream down his neck, soaking into the high collar of his shirt. Sasuke, no. Stop moving. We need to. Shut up, Dobe, Sasuke wheezed, a ghost of his old smirk twisting his bloodied lips. His eyes locked onto Naruto's with an intensity that pinned him in place. Listen, my life is over. I can feel it. The spine, the artery, it's done. Don't say that. We'll get Kakashi-sensei, will. There's no time. The force of the whisper was a command. Sasuke's hand, slick with his own blood, came up. In it, the two blood-tipped sunbon gleamed. My dream dies with me, but yours doesn't have to. Naruto's mind, fogged with panic and the fox's rage, couldn't parse the words. What are you? Sasuke's last reserve of strength was a Uchiha strength, born of a wolf forged in the fires of genocide. In one fluid, brutal motion, he brought his hands up, not to attack an enemy, but to bestow a legacy. He plunged the two Senbon into Naruto's eyes. There was a moment of blinding, white-hot agony, a sensation of liquid heat and popping pressure. And then nothing. The world, Sasuke's bloody, determined face, the glittering ice mirrors, the gray sky, vanished into an absolute, impenetrable blackness. Naruto screamed, a sound of pure, physical and psychological torment, clawing at his face. His hands came away wet, but not just with his tears. I'm sorry for this. Sasuke's voice was closer now, a dying breath against his ear. He was slumped against Naruto, his weight growing heavier. Take them after this mission. Have the Medicine transplant my eyes. The Sharingan is yours now. Sasuke, you bastard. What did you do? Naruto wailed, blind and helpless, clutching his friend's collapsing form. My goal, Itachi Uchiha. The name was a curse and a prayer on Sasuke's lips. Kill him. Avenge our clan. Then, I'll rest easy in the Pure Land, knowing you completed my goal. A violent, racking cough seized him, bringing up more blood. He was fading, the words becoming fainter, forced out with his last vestiges of life. And become Hokage, brother. The final word hung in the frozen air, a benediction and a burden. Brother. It was an acknowledgement of their rivalry, their fights, their unshakable bond forged in the crucible of Team 7. It was a title Sasuke had never spoken aloud. Then, the grip on Naruto's wrist went slack. The weight against him became a dead weight. The shallow, ragged breathing stopped. Silence. In that void of sight and sound, something within Naruto Uzumaki broke open. Not just grief, though that was a tsunami threatening to drown him, but the last barrier to the entity sealed within his navel. The red chakra didn't just leak, it erupted. A column of furious, crimson energy exploded from his small form, shattering the ice mirrors around them into a million glittering shards. The force of it blasted Haku, who had been watching in stunned, horrified silence, clean out of their formation. Naruto rose. A bestial, guttural growl reverberated from his chest, no longer entirely human. A single, fox-like tail of dense chakra materialized behind him, lashing the air. His features sharpened, his whisker marks darkening. But his eyes, the ruined sockets, streamed with a mixture of blood and corrosive red chakra. He was blind, but the Kyuubi did not need eyes to hunt. It used scent, the metallic tang of blood, Sasuke's his own. The unique chakra signature of the ice user, Haku, now trembling with a new kind of fear. It used sound, the frantic heartbeat of its prey, the crunch of ice underfoot. It used pure, homicidal instinct. You hurt my brother. The voice was a layered nightmare, Naruto's own twisted and deepened by the fox's malice. Haku, a master of silent assassination, was completely unprepared for this. This wasn't a shinobi fight. It was a predator's slaughter. Naruto moved in a blur of red, a feral scream tearing from his throat. He didn't throw kunai. He didn't form hand signs. He clawed, he battered, he ripped with chakra-enhanced strength that pulverized ice and flesh alike. Haku's speed was meaningless against this omnidirectional, sensory rage. Mirrors were smashed before Haku could enter them. Sunban shattered against the red chakra cloak. It was a brutal, one-sided dismantling that ended with Naruto's chakra-clawed hand thrust through Haku's chest, the Hunter-Nin's mask cracking to reveal eyes wide with pain, regret, and a strange, sorrowful acceptance. As Haku's life faded, whispering apologies to Zabuza, the red chakra around Naruto receded like a tide, leaving him kneeling on the bloody, ice-strewn cement, blind, empty, and hollow. The weight of Sasuke's body against him was the only anchor in a world of nothingness. Across the bridge, the battle had reached its climax. Kakashi Hatake, his own Sharingan whirling, had seen the crimson explosion of chakra, had felt its vile, overwhelming hatred. A cold dread, colder than any of Haku's ice, had seized his heart. Naruto, Sasuke, but he could not afford to look. Not with Zabuza Momochi, the demon of the hidden mist, bearing down on him with the full fury of a man who had just watched his own weapon, his sole companion, fall. It was the grief in Zabuza's roar, a mirror to the one he knew was tearing at Naruto, that gave Kakashi the final, grim opening. As Zabuza charged, no longer a calculating mercenary, but a grieving beast, Kakashi performed the Chidori. The sound of 1,000 birds screeching filled the air, a dissonant elegy. He met Zabuza's final, desperate charge head-on, the lightning cutter piercing the Mist-Nin's heart. Zabuza fell, his last breaths used not to curse his killer, but to ask Kakashi to take him to Haku's side. As the mist began to thin, stained pink with the setting sun and the blood of the fallen, Kakashi turned and ran, his heart hammering against his ribs. The scene he came upon would be seared into his memory forever. In a circle of destroyed ice and scarred cement, Naruto Uzumaki knelt. He was cradling Sasuke Uchiha's limp form in his arms, rocking slightly. Blood, so much blood, covered them both, a macabre paint on orange and blue. Naruto's face was tilted upward, sightless eyes wide open, twin trails of dried blood and tears carving paths through the grime on his cheeks. He made no sound, but the sheer, silent devastation radiating from his small frame was louder than any scream. Naruto! Kakashi's voice was hoarse. He approached slowly, his own body aching with exhaustion and a grief he hadn't allowed himself to feel since the death of his own team. "He's gone, Kakashi-sensei," Naruto whispered, his voice flat dead. "Sasuke's gone. He gave me his eyes. He told me to kill Itachi. He called me brother." Each word was a hammer blow. Kakashi's single eye widened, taking in the Senbon on the ground, the specific wounds. The horrific, profound truth of it crashed over him. A bloodline limit, willingly bestowed in a final act of twisted love and desperate legacy. The Uchiha clan's last loyal son was dead, and he had passed their cursed power to the village's pariah, its Jinchuriki. The sun dipped below the horizon of the land of waves, casting long, deep shadows. The battle was won. The bridge, a symbol of hope, stood, but on its cold surface, Team 7 lay shattered. Kakashi stood over the broken form of his student, the boy who held a demon and now carried the eyes of a ghost, and knew nothing would ever be the same again. The legacy of the Uchiha and the destiny of Naruto Uzumaki had just been fused in the most tragic, bloody, and irrevocable way imaginable. A new life, born from the fall of a brother, began in that moment of utter darkness. The world came back to Kakashi in a horrifying, overlapping echo. The metallic scent of blood, so thick in the air of the bridge, transposed itself over the phantom smell of rain-slicked stone from a night 17 years past. The weight of Sasuke's still form in his mind's eye bled into the memory of another Uchiha, Obito, crushed and broken beneath a boulder, offering a final gift with his last breath. "I'm giving you my Sharingan." For a vertiginous second, Kakashi wasn't on the great Naruto bridge. He was in the hell of Canopy Bridge, the cries of his teammates, Rin's horrified shrieks, Obito's fading voice, superimposed over the present. The cycle of loss, of gifted eyes and shattered teams, was a nightmare repeating itself with cruel precision. His own Sharingan, the one Obito had given him, throbbed dully in its socket, a permanent, aching reminder. Not again. Please, not again. His paralysis was shattered by a sound that cut sharper than any Senbon. Sasuke Kuyuin, Sakura Haruno, who had been fighting her own battle against terror and irrelevance on the sidelines, finally broke from her cover. Her green eyes, wide with denial, took in the scene. The shattered ice, the blood, the two boys at the center of it all. She saw Naruto, frozen and bloodied, holding Sasuke. She saw the unnatural angle of Sasuke's neck, the pallor of his skin, the absolute stillness of the proud Uchiha posture. A raw, wounded animal sound ripped from her throat. She stumbled forward, her legs barely holding her, and collapsed beside them. Her hands, trembling violently, hovered over Sasuke's chest, his face, afraid to touch, yet desperate for a sign of life. "No, no, 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 no," she chanted, the word a desperate prayer against reality. Her tears fell freely, splashing onto Sasuke's blood-stained shirt. She reached out, her fingers brushing a lock of his inky hair from his forehead, a gesture of tender familiarity that felt obscene in the face of death. "Sasuke-kun, wake up. Please, you have to wake up. You can't do this." Her grief was vocal, physical, a storm of anguish. She shook his shoulder gently, then more frantically. "We're a team. We just started. You can't leave. You promised you'd get stronger. You promised you'd." Her words dissolved into incoherent sobs, her body curling in on itself as she clutched at his arm, as if she could physically tether his spirit to the world. Her shrieks and cries painted the air with a color of loss that was entirely different from Naruto's silent cataclysm. They were the audible heartbreak of a world that had just lost its son, its focal point. And Naruto, just inches away, heard it all from within his absolute darkness. Each of Sakura's sobs was a needle driving deeper into the hollow space Sasuke had left behind. He could feel the vibration of her grief through the cold cement. But he was frozen, encased in a shell of shock and a new, terrifying sensory deprivation. The only person whose voice had ever carried a thread of acknowledgement, not of the demon, but of Naruto, was gone. Their rivalry, their grudging respect, their unspoken bond forged in 1,000 shared glances and synchronized moves during training. It had been the closest thing to brotherhood he'd ever known. A bond fought for, not given, and he hadn't even seen it end. That was the cruelest cut, Sasuke's final act. The painful, bloody gift, the weight of his dying words, the ghost of a smirk, had been given in total darkness. Naruto had felt it, heard it, but he had not seen it. He would never have the visual memory of his friend's last expression, the look in his eyes as he called him brother. That moment, the most profound of his young life, existed only as sound, touch, and smell, blood, cold metal, and the fading warmth of Sasuke's breath. It was a memory half-formed, forever incomplete, a painting with the central figure torn out. He was blind in more ways than one. The world was black, and the one person who had truly seen him, not the container, not the clown, but the determined, loyal boy underneath, was gone. The warmth against his side was cooling rapidly, a terrible metric of time passing, of life departing. Kakashi, shaking off the ghosts of the past, forced himself to move. He was a jonin, a leader. His own grief was a luxury he could not afford. He knelt first beside Sakura, his hand coming to rest gently on her shaking shoulder. "Sakura," he said, his voice low and strained but deliberately calm. "Sakura, look at me." She turned her tear-streaked, shattered face to him. "Sensei's, I know," Kakashi said, the words heavy. "I need you to be strong now. For the team. I need to check on Naruto." The mention of Naruto seemed to barely register through her wall of grief for Sasuke. She nodded numbly, her sobs subsiding into silent, heaving tremors, her gaze fixing back on Sasuke's face as if by staring hard enough she could reverse what had happened. Kakashi shifted his position, coming to kneel in front of Naruto. The boy hadn't moved a muscle. His face, turned toward Kakashi's voice, was a mask of dried blood and blank shock. The eyelids were closed now, but the damage was evident. "Naruto," Kakashi said softly, his professional eye already assessing the horrific injury. The Sunban strikes were precise, deliberate. Not an attack, but a procedure. Sasuke's last, brutal act of will. "Naruto, can you hear me?" A slow, almost imperceptible nod. "The mission is over. Zabuza and Haku are dead. The bridge is secure." He delivered the facts, an anchor in the storm. "I need you to let go of Sasuke now. I need to prepare him for the journey home." The word home seemed to trigger something. A fresh tear, clear this time, traced a path through the grime on Naruto's cheek. "He gave me his eyes," Naruto repeated, his voice a hollow monotone. "He said take them, kill Itachi, become Hokage." A shuddering breath. "He called me brother." "I know," Kakashi said, his own heart constricting. The legacy, the burden, was immense, and it was now irrevocably Naruto's to carry. "We will honor his will, Naruto, but right now, I need you to trust me. I need to take care of both of you." With infinite gentleness, Kakashi pried Naruto's stiff, blood-caked fingers from Sasuke's jacket. He then carefully gathered Sasuke's body into his arms, arranging the limbs with a somber respect. The Uchiha boy felt tragically small, the weight of his ambition and hatred gone, leaving only the fragile shell of a 13-year-old. Sakura let out a fresh whimper as Kakashi lifted him. Naruto, now empty-armed, listlessly brought his hands up to his face again, his fingers probing the sealed, ruined lids. The physical pain was a distant echo compared to the cavernous void inside him. He was alone in the dark, with only the dying echo of a brother's last request and the sound of a teammate weeping for the boy he could no longer see. The sunset had faded fully, plunging the land of waves into a deep, misty twilight. Kakashi Hatake stood on the silent bridge, a dead student in his arms and a broken, blinded one at his feet. The victory was ashes. The cost was written in blood and gifted eyes, a price that would forever alter the destiny of the boy who dreamed of Hokage, and the future of the village he hoped to lead. The return to Konoha was a journey made in a shroud of grim silence. Kakashi had handled the aftermath on the bridge with a chilling, efficient calm that spoke of a man too acquainted with death. He had spoken to Tazuna and the villagers, his single visible eye flat and unreadable, arranging for the bridge's completion, a bittersweet monument to the blood spilled for its foundation. He had sent a message ahead via a Konoha messenger hawk, its contents brief, coded, and bearing the weight of catastrophe. The bodies of Zabuza and Haku were given a mercenary's pyre on the edge of the mist. Their story was over. For Naruto and Sakura, the voyage was a blur of sensory fragments and emotional numbness. Naruto sat rigidly in the boat, then the wagon, a thick bandage covering the upper half of his face, courtesy of Kakashi's field medic kit. The world was reduced to sounds. The lap of water, the creak of wagon wheels, the low murmur of Kakashi's voice giving terse instructions. And beneath it all, a constant, deafening echo. Asterisk brother. Kill Itachi. Become Hokage. Asterisk the words were a mantra of obligation and loss, playing on a loop in the dark theater of his mind. Sakura, meanwhile, was trapped in a prison of her own thoughts. She watched Naruto's unnaturally still form, the usual vibrant energy utterly extinguished. She glanced at the long, wrapped bundle Kakashi carried with solemn care. Sasuke's body, prepared for the journey home. Each glance was a physical blow. Her mind replayed the fight on the bridge in excruciating, guilty detail. Her paralysis, her uselessness. While Sasuke and Naruto fought back-to-back, she had hidden. While Sasuke gave his life, she had watched. The memory was a corrosive acid, eating away at her heart. Asterisk, I was weak. My weakness let him die. If I had been stronger, faster, braver, asterisk. They passed through the towering gates of Konoha as the sun was setting, casting long, accusing shadows. The village bustled with its usual late-afternoon rhythm, a normalcy that felt like a grotesque parody. Kakashi stopped just inside the gate, his posture weary to its bones. Sakura, he said, his voice low, take Naruto directly to the hospital. Tell the receptionist for me. Do not leave his side. I will deal with everything else. His eye flicked toward the wrapped bundle, then to the Hokage's tower looming in the distance. The third Hokage would need to be informed. The Uchiha compound, already a ghost town, would need to be officially notified of the demise of its last scion. The paperwork of death awaited him. Sakura nodded mutely, a fresh lump in her throat. She moved to Naruto's side, her hand finding his arm. His muscles were tense as coiled wire. Come on, Naruto, she said, her voice thick. The hospital is this way. Naruto offered no resistance. He simply turned his head slightly toward the sound of her voice and allowed himself to be guided. His other hand came up, fingers brushing the rough fabric of the bandage over his eyes, a subconscious, futile gesture. Their walk through the village streets was a slow, torturous procession. Sakura, her heart a leaden weight in her chest, navigated the familiar paths by rote, her attention split between guiding Naruto and the reactions around them. People stared. Two genin, one clearly injured and blindfolded, the other with eyes red raw from crying and clothes still stained with dirt and dried blood, were an unusual sight. Whispers trailed in their wake like poisonous vines. Isn't that Team 7's girl? And that boy. Looks like they got into real trouble. A seer ain't gone wrong, I heard. The Uchiha brat isn't with them. Odd. That blindfold, what happened to his eyes? Naruto, in his darkness, was spared the visual judgment, but he was hyper-aware of the whispers, the sudden silences as they passed, the faint clicks of shutters closing. The village's ambient hostility, usually a background noise he shouted over, was now a palpable, smothering blanket. He tightened his grip on Sakura's arm. Sakura felt each glance like a physical prick. Her grief was private, a sacred, terrible thing, and it felt profaned by these curious, pitying, or indifferent stares. The guilt and sorrow within her began to curdle into something sharper, more volatile. They turned a corner into a market street, the smell of produce and fish thick in the air. A woman in an apron, arranging cabbages at a stall, looked up as they passed. Her eyes, hard and familiar with the village's unspoken prejudices, landed on Naruto's headband and his distinctive spiky blonde hair beneath the bandage. Her lips twisted into a familiar scowl of disapproval. She didn't speak loudly, but in the relative quiet of the street, her muttered words carried like a dart. "Serves that demon brat right, bringing his curse on others. Poor Uchiha boy, probably dead because of him." Naruto, his world defined by echoes, didn't catch the specific words, only the venomous tone. He flinched minutely. Sakura, however, heard them with crystalline, devastating clarity. Every ounce of her guilt, her grief, her fury at her own weakness, and her shattered adoration for Sasuke coalesced into a white-hot point of rage. The woman's words weren't just an insult to Naruto. They were a blasphemy against Sasuke's sacrifice, a reduction of his final, profound act to the village's stupid, hateful narrative. Time seemed to slow. Her analytical mind, usually calculating chakra points or tactical advantages, shut down. "Nothing," she said, her voice chillingly calm, a stark contrast to the tempest in her eyes. "A rotten vegetable fell. Let's keep going." She guided him forward, stepping over a rolling, bruised tomato. The crowd parted for them now, but this time the stairs were different, wider, tinged with shock and a new, wary fear. The incident was a footnote, a burst of violence quickly buried under the market's murmurs, but it etched itself into Sakura's soul. It wasn't just about defending Naruto. It was the first, visceral manifestation of a new, brutal truth. The world that had taken Sasuke was a cruel, unforgiving place. Politeness and book smarts were worthless. Only strength mattered. Strength to protect what remained. Strength to avenge what was lost. Her weakness had allowed Sasuke to die. She would never, ever be weak again. She continued their journey, the phantom sensation of the slap still buzzing in her palm, the image of the crushed vegetables mirroring the crushed future of their team. The hospital's sterile, white facade loomed ahead, a gateway to another kind of ordeal. Behind them, in the vibrant, uncaring life of the village, the echoes of a brother's last wish and the first crack in a kunoichi's old self faded into the gathering dusk. The climb to the Hokage's office was a longer, steeper ascent than Kakashi remembered. Each step up the tower's central staircase echoed in the hollow space where his team used to be. The two Chunin guards at the heavy oak door gave him a solemn nod, their usual casual deference replaced by a grim understanding. Bad news traveled fast in the shinobi rumor mill, especially news carried by a jonin with death in his posture. He entered without knocking. The office was as it always was, shelves groaning with scrolls, the wide desk littered with paperwork, the large window framing the village lights beginning to twinkle in the dusk. The air smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, and a profound, weary authority. Sarutobi Hiruzen, the third Hokage, stood by the window, his back to the door, looking out over his village. He didn't turn as Kakashi approached the desk and placed a sealed mission scroll upon it. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the distant sounds of the village and the slow, deliberate tapping of Hiruzen's pipe against the windowsill. Kakashi began his debrief. His voice was a monotone, a clinical recitation of facts stripped of all emotion. The false C-rank, the Demon Brothers, the Mist, Zabuza Momochi, the Hunter Nin, Haku, the trap on the bridge. He detailed the strategies, the near misses, the application of tree-walking training. He spoke of Naruto and Sasuke's developing teamwork, their instinctual coordination to free him from the water prison. He was methodical, precise, a perfect reporting shinobi. Then he reached the climax on the bridge. His voice, for the first time, faltered ever so slightly. He described the demonic ice mirrors. Haku's Senbon, Sasuke's push, the fatal wounds, and then the part that made his own gifted eye ache with phantom pain. Sasuke's final, conscious act, the removal of the Senbon, the brutal, willing transfer, the last words, kill Itachi, become Hokage brother. He finished with the Kyuubi's eruption, Haku's death, Zaboz's end, and the silent, shattered tableau he had found. He fell silent. The only sound was the faint scratch of Hiruzen's pen as he took a few notes on a corner of a report, his face unreadable. Finally, the Hokage sighed. It was a deep, weary exhalation that seemed to come from the very foundations of the village. He set his pipe down and closed his eyes, the lines on his face deepening into canyons of regret and burden. He wasn't going to rant at Kakashi. There was no point. Genin died on missions. It was the tragic arithmetic of the shinobi world, a cost factored into every deployment order he signed. Kakashi was a jonin of the highest caliber. He knew the risks, and he had done everything a commander could. A lecture on failure would be a hypocrisy of the highest order, a disrespect to the dead and the grieving. The failure, Hiruzen knew in his old bones, was systemic, historical. It lay in the choices that led to the Uchiha massacre, in the creation of a Jinchuriki who was hated, in a village that bred orphans and then sent them out to die for its walls. So, Hiruzen said, his voice gravelly with suppressed emotion. He opened his eyes, staring at the mission scroll as if it were a funeral notice. The last loyal son of the Uchiha is gone. He paused, the next name a ghost in the room, a specter that haunted both their pasts. Now, only Itachi remains. The mention of that name was a taboo, a key to a locked room filled with national shame and unspeakable horror. It hung between them, charged and terrible. Itachi Uchiha, prodigy, murderer, missing Nin, and now, the sole surviving bearer of a massacred clan's name, and the target of a dead boy's vengeance, passed to a blind vessel of demonic power. The Hokage turned from the window, his aged eyes settling on Kakashi. He saw not just the elite jonin, but the boy who had lost his father, his teammate, his sensei, and now his student. The cycle was cruel. Kakashi, Hiruzen asked, his tone shifting from leader to something akin to a weary grandfather. How are you feeling? Kakashi's visible eye remained fixed on a point just above the Hokage's shoulder. A myriad of answers flickered behind his mask. Numb. Hollow. Like history is a record stuck on the same tragic groove. Like I failed another Uchiha who looked to me. What he said was, honestly, Hokage-sama, I just want to finish this debriefing now. It was not disrespect. It was survival. To stop, to dwell, was to invite the ghosts of Rin, of Obito, of Minato-sensei, and now of Sasuke, to congregate in his mind. He needed motion, a duty. Hiruzen nodded slowly, a profound understanding in his gaze. He did not press. He reached into a drawer of his desk and withdrew not a pen, but a small, intricate stamp set in a square of dark cherry wood. It was the official seal of the Hokage, its design granting absolute authority for procedures within the village. He held it for a moment, feeling its weight, the weight of decision, of altering a destiny. Go to the hospital, Hiruzen said, his voice firm now, the leader once more. Oversee the procedure. Ensure the boy's will is respected. He extended the stamp. This grants full authorization to the head medic for the transplant and for any subsequent, unique care Naruto-kun may require. The boy's will, not a medical necessity, but a last request. A bloodline succession enacted not by birth, but by death and choice. Hiruzen was sanctioning it. He was making it official Konoha business. Kakashi took the stamp. The wood was cool, the carved edges sharp against his palm. It was heavier than any weapon. He didn't bow, didn't offer platitudes. He simply closed his fingers around it, turned, and left the office as silently as he had entered, a solitary figure carrying the permission to sow the legacy of one lost boy into the flesh of another. Behind him, Hiruzen sank into his chair, the weight of the village, of its sins and its losses, settling upon his shoulders once more. Outside, the night deepened, unaware of the seismic shift that had just been authorized within the sterile walls of the hospital, where a piece of the Uchiha clan's tragedy was about to find a new, unimaginable home. The Konoha hospital stood as a bastion of sterile, whitewashed order, its clean lines and antiseptic smell a stark contrast to the mud, blood, and visceral chaos of the land of waves. To Sakura, it felt less like a place of healing and more like a cold, judgmental tribunal. She guided Naruto through the sliding glass doors, the automatic hiss sounding like a sharp intake of breath. The lobby was quiet, the evening shift settling in. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pale, unforgiving glow on the polished linoleum. Behind the high, laminate reception desk sat a woman in a crisp nurse's uniform, her hair in a severe bun, her attention fixed on a clipboard. She looked up as they approached, her eyes performing a swift, professional assessment. They flicked over Sakura's disheveled appearance, the dark stains on her clothes, the lingering redness around her eyes. Then they moved to Naruto. They noted the standard issue forehead protector, the shock of blonde hair, and most prominently, the thick, field dress bandage covering his eyes. A flicker of recognition, followed by a subtle but unmistakable hardening, passed over her features. It was a look Sakura was coming to know intimately, the village's ingrained prejudice manifesting in a single, dismissive glance. "We need to see a medic Nin immediately," Sakura stated, her voice attempting authority but frayed at the edges. "Hatake Kakashi sent us. It's urgent." The receptionist's lips thinned. She didn't open the ledger. Instead, she adopted a tone of bureaucratic boredom laced with veiled contempt. "Urgent cases are seen based on triage priority. There are procedures. And given the nature of this patient's condition," she said, her eyes lingering on Naruto's bandage as if it were a contaminated object, certain specialized containment protocols might need to be reviewed before he can be admitted to a general ward. "You can wait over there. A doctor will be with you when one is available." She gestured dismissively toward a row of hard plastic chairs in the corner. It was the dismissal, the cold, procedural wall erected not out of genuine protocol, but out of fear and loathing for the boy standing helplessly beside her. It was the final straw on a day that had seen her world end. Sakura's vision tunneled. The sterile white walls seemed to pulse. The hum of the lights became the buzz of the ice mirrors. The receptionist's pinched face blurred with the memory of the market woman's scowling visage. "Weakness. Your weakness let him die. And this is the world that created the weakness." Naruto, attuned to the sudden, tense silence, shifted his weight. "Sakura-chan? What's wrong?" The receptionist opened her mouth to utter another placating, venomous dismissal. Sakura did not let her speak. Her body was a coiled spring released. There was no dramatic wind-up, no shouted warning. One moment she was holding Naruto's arm. The next she had leaned across the high desk. Her hand, the same one that had struck the vegetable seller, shot out with even more precise, controlled fury. The slap connected with the woman's cheek with a sound like a gunshot in the quiet lobby, a sharp, wet crack that echoed off the walls. The force was not enough to send her flying, but it was brutal. The woman's head snapped to the side, her bun coming undone, strands of hair whipping across her stunned face. Her clipboard clattered to the floor, papers scattering. She staggered back against the filing cabinets, a hand flying to her already reddening cheek, her eyes wide with shock and pain, all bureaucratic pretense shattered. Absolute silence descended, broken only by the persistent hum of the lights. Naruto jumped at the sound. "Sakura-chan, what was that?" Sakura slowly withdrew her hand, her knuckles white. She didn't look at the stunned, weeping receptionist. She looked directly ahead, her emerald eyes glazed with a terrifying, icy calm. "HN. It was a misplaced clipboard falling," she said, her voice flat and utterly devoid of its usual expressive range. "It must have startled you." She then turned her chilling gaze back to the receptionist, who was now cowering, one hand on her face. "Now," Sakura said, each word dropping like a stone. "A private room. For Uzumaki Naruto, Genin of Team 7, under the direct order of Jonin Commander Hitaki Kakashi. And you will fetch a senior medic Nin. Not when one is available. Now." There was no argument. The woman, sniffling and terrified, fumbled with her keys and led them out from behind the desk with unsteady steps, abandoning her post. She didn't guide them so much as she fled ahead of them, the imprint of Sakura's hand livid on her face. The walk down the long, disinfectant-scented corridor was surreal. The nurse's squeaking shoes led the way. Sakura guided Naruto, whose face was a mask of confusion and dawning comprehension. He said nothing. The echo of that slap, so much sharper and more final than the one in the market, told him everything he needed to know about the reception they had received. They were shown into a small, private examination room, a concession undoubtedly born of fear, not protocol. The nurse fled without another word, the door swinging shut behind her. In the sudden quiet, the reality of where they were settled in, the room was cold, all gleaming metal surfaces and the faint, astringent smell of iodine. A padded examination table dominated the center. She wasn't going to help, was she? Naruto asked quietly, his face turned toward where he guessed Sakura was standing. Sakura didn't answer directly. She helped him sit on the edge of the cold table. "It doesn't matter," she finally said, the ice in her voice thawing slightly into sheer exhaustion. "They'll help now." She stood beside him, a lone, stubborn sentinel in the sterile room, waiting for the medic Nin who would determine the physical fate of Naruto's eyes, while the ghost of Sasuke Uchiha and the echo of 2 slaps hung heavily in the air between them. The hospital, a place of healing, had become the next battlefield, and Sakura had just drawn a very clear, very violent line in the sand. The climb to the Hokage's office was a longer, steeper ascent than Kakashi remembered. Each step up the tower's central staircase echoed in the hollow space where his team used to be. The 2 Chunin guards at the heavy oak door gave him a solemn nod, their usual casual deference replaced by a grim understanding. Bad news traveled fast in the shinobi rumor mill, especially news carried by a jonin with death in his posture. He entered without knocking. The office was as it always was, shelves groaning with scrolls, the wide desk littered with paperwork, the large window framing the village lights beginning to twinkle in the dusk. The air smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, and a profound, weary authority. Sarutobi Hiruzen, the 3rd Hokage, stood by the window, his back to the door, looking out over his village. He didn't turn as Kakashi approached the desk and placed a sealed mission scroll upon it. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the distant sounds of the village and the slow, deliberate tapping of Hiruzen's pipe against the windowsill. Kakashi began his debrief. His voice was a monotone, a clinical recitation of facts stripped of all emotion. The false C-rank, the demon brothers, the mist, Zabuza Momochi, the hunter Nin, Haku, the trap on the bridge. He detailed the strategies, the near misses, the application of tree-walking training. He spoke of Naruto and Sasuke's developing teamwork, their instinctual coordination to free him from the water prison. He was methodical, precise, a perfect reporting shinobi. Then he reached the climax on the bridge. His voice, for the first time, faltered ever so slightly. He described the demonic ice mirrors, Haku's Senbon, Sasuke's push, the fatal wounds, and then the part that made his own gifted eye ache with phantom pain. Sasuke's final, conscious act, the removal of the Senbon, the brutal, willing transfer, the last words, "Kill Itachi, become Hokage, brother." He finished with the Kyuubi's eruption, Haku's death, Zabuza's end, and the silent, shattered tableau he had found. He fell silent. The only sound was the faint scratch of Hiruzen's pen as he took a few notes on a corner of a report, his face unreadable. Finally, the Hokage sighed. It was a deep, weary exhalation that seemed to come from the very foundations of the village. He set his pipe down and closed his eyes, the lines on his face deepening into canyons of regret and burden. He wasn't going to rant at Kakashi. There was no point. Genin died on missions. It was the tragic arithmetic of the shinobi world, a cost factored into every deployment order he signed. Kakashi was a jonin of the highest caliber. He knew the risks, and he had done everything a commander could. A lecture on failure would be a hypocrisy of the highest order, a disrespect to the dead and the grieving. The failure, Hiruzen knew in his old bones, was systemic, historical. It lay in the choices that led to the Uchiha massacre, in the creation of a Jinchuriki who was hated, in a village that bred orphans and then sent them out to die for its walls. So, Hiruzen said, his voice gravelly with suppressed emotion. He opened his eyes, staring at the mission scroll as if it were a funeral notice. The last loyal son of the Uchiha is gone. He paused, the next name a ghost in the room, a specter that haunted both their pasts. Now, only Itachi remains. The mention of that name was a taboo, a key to a locked room filled with national shame and unspeakable horror. It hung between them, charged and terrible. Itachi Uchiha, prodigy, murderer, missing Nin, and now the sole surviving bearer of a massacred clan's name, and the target of a dead boy's vengeance, passed to a blind vessel of demonic power. The Hokage turned from the window, his aged eyes settling on Kakashi. He saw not just the elite jonin, but the boy who had lost his father, his teammate, his sensei, and now his student. The cycle was cruel. "Kakashi," Hiruzen asked, his tone shifting from leader to something akin to a weary grandfather. "How are you feeling?" Kakashi's visible eye remained fixed on a point just above the Hokage's shoulder. A myriad of answers flickered behind his mask. Numb. Hollow. Like history is a record stuck on the same tragic groove. Like I failed another Uchiha who looked to me. What he said was, "Honestly, Hokage-sama, I just want to finish this debriefing now." It was not disrespect. It was survival. To stop, to dwell, was to invite the ghosts of Rin, of Obito, of Minato-sensei, and now of Sasuke, to congregate in his mind. He needed motion, a duty. Hiruzen nodded slowly, a profound understanding in his gaze. He did not press. He reached into a drawer of his desk and withdrew not a pen, but a small, intricate stamp set in a square of dark cherry wood. It was the official seal of the Hokage, its design granting absolute authority for procedures within the village. He held it for a moment, feeling its weight, the weight of decision, of altering a destiny. "Go to the hospital," Hiruzen said, his voice firm now, the leader once more. "Oversee the procedure. Ensure the boy's will is respected." He extended the stamp. "This grants full authorization to the head medic. For the transplant, and for any subsequent, unique care Naruto-kun may require." The boy's will. Not a medical necessity, but a last request. A bloodline succession enacted not by birth, but by death and choice. Hiruzen was sanctioning it. He was making it official Konoha business. Kakashi took the stamp. The wood was cool, the carved edges sharp against his palm. It was heavier than any weapon. He didn't bow, didn't offer platitudes. He simply closed his fingers around it, turned, and left the office as silently as he had entered, a solitary figure carrying the permission to sow the legacy of one lost boy into the flesh of another. Behind him, Hiruzen sank into his chair, the weight of the village, of its sins and its losses, settling upon his shoulders once more. Outside, the night deepened, unaware of the seismic shift that had just been authorized within the sterile walls of the hospital, where a piece of the Uchiha clan's tragedy was about to find a new, unimaginable home. The hospital corridor outside the surgical suite was a study in sterile, anxious silence. The air, thick with the scent of antiseptic and bleached linens, did little to cleanse the deeper stench of blood and loss that seemed to cling to Kakashi and Sakura. They occupied a small, harshly lit waiting area, a world of vinyl chairs and faded motivational posters about health that felt like a cruel joke. Kakashi leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his single visible eye fixed on the blank, metallic doors of the operating theater. He had handed the Hokage seal to the head medic, a stern-faced man with hands that spoke of decades of precise, life-altering work. No questions were asked. The stamp was law. The medic had only nodded, his eyes briefly flickering with a complex emotion, part professional curiosity, part profound unease, before assembling his most trusted team. The Uchiha eyes, preserved in a special chakra-infused solution, were brought from the cold storage of the morgue with a level of ceremony usually reserved for state secrets. Inside that sealed room, under lights brighter than the sun, a procedure of immense delicacy and dark symbolism was underway. What remained of Uzumaki Naruto's ruined eyes, the lenses shattered, the optic nerves severed by the precise, desperate strikes of the Senbon, were carefully, respectfully removed. The surgeons worked with a reverence that bordered on dread. They were not just removing damaged tissue. They were excising the last vestige of Naruto's original sight, the blue eyes that had held such defiant, unwavering light. Then came the grafting, the onyx eyes of Uchiha Sasuke, still holding the profound, genetic potential of the Sharingan, dormant but alive within their unique chakra pathways, were lifted from their preservative bath. The connection of the optic nerves was a work of microscopic genius, a fusion of Uzumaki vitality and Uchiha legacy. Chakra threads finer than spider silk were used to stitch the alien organ into the familiar socket, to coax Naruto's formidable life force to accept, to nourish, to claim this final, bloody gift. The procedure was silent, save for the beep of monitors and the soft, clipped commands of the lead surgeon. It proceeded with a smooth, chilling efficiency. There were no complications, no rejections, as if the eyes themselves were waiting for this vessel, as if the will of the donor was guiding the surgeon's hands. Outside, time lost meaning. Sakura sat rigidly in one of the vinyl chairs, her back straight, her hands clenched in her lap. She had not gone home. She had not changed her blood-stained clothes. She had not slept. The image of Sasuke's cooling body on the bridge was a wound that bled inwardly, a psychic injury that threatened to paralyze her. The proud tilt of his head gone slack, the fierce intelligence in his dark eyes extinguished. It was a sight that had carved a canyon of grief through her spirit. She had loved him, admired him, built her world around him, and in a single moment, that world had turned to ash. But then she had looked at Naruto. She had seen the blank shock, the bandaged ruin of his face, the utter lostness of him as he held Sasuke's body. He was adrift in a darkness more complete than any she could imagine. Sasuke was gone, but Naruto was here, broken and bearing a burden she could scarcely comprehend. In that dichotomy, her crumbling spirit found a desperate, flinty resolve. Sasuke was beyond her help, but Naruto was not. His survival, his sanity, his ability to carry the weight Sasuke had placed upon him, that became her new mission. It was a purpose forged in the fires of loss, a way to honor Sasuke not with tears, but with action, to protect what her precious person had chosen to save. Kakashi watched her from his post by the wall. He saw the steel forming in her young spine, the grief being hammered into something harder. He recognized the signs. He had built his own persona on similar ruins. He said nothing. There were no platitudes that could bridge the chasm they were in. His own mind was a quiet storm. He thought of Obito, of Rin, of the endless cycle of gifted eyes and inherited hatreds. Was this progress, or merely a darker repetition? Naruto, with the Kyuubi and now the Sharingan, was a confluence of Konoha's greatest sins and greatest weapons. What would he become? Hours passed. The night shift cycled in. A nurse brought them untouched cups of bitter tea that grew cold on the small table between them. Finally, with a soft hydraulic hiss, the metallic doors to the surgical suite swung open. The lead medic emerged, peeling off his cap and mask. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were clear. He nodded to Kakashi. "The procedure is complete." It was textbook, he said, the word feeling inadequate. "The graphs are taking. His Uzumaki constitution is remarkable. The chakra pathways are already aligning. He's sedated and in recovery. The bandages must remain for at least 72 hours to allow for full neural and chakra integration. After that," the medic paused, choosing his words with care. "After that, we will see if the donor's genetic traits manifest, and we will assess his sight." Kakashi gave a shallow bow of thanks. "Understood." Sakura was on her feet, her knuckles white. "Can we see him?" The medic considered, then nodded. "Briefly. He is unconscious. Do not disturb the bandages." They were led to a private recovery room. Naruto lay on the bed, looking smaller than ever amidst the tubes and monitors. A fresh, clean bandage was wrapped around his head, covering the new eyes beneath. His chest rose and fell steadily. He looked peaceful, a stark contrast to the bloodied, furious, broken boy of the bridge. Sakura approached the bedside slowly. She didn't reach out to touch him. She simply stood there, looking at the bandage, imagining the onyx eyes resting beneath, eyes that had once looked at her with disdain, then indifference, then faint acknowledgement. Now they were part of Naruto. It was terrifying and sacred. Kakashi stood in the doorway, a silent sentinel. The first step was over. The eyes were in place. But the true procedure, the grafting of Sasuke's vengeance, his ambition, his ghost onto Naruto's soul, was only just beginning. In this quiet, sterile room, as the village slept unaware, Uzumaki Naruto's new life truly commenced, sightless for now, but forever changed in the dark. The walk from the hospital to the Haruno residence was a journey through a ghost town. The vibrant colors of the shops, the warm glow from house windows, the cheerful chatter of evening life. All of it passed by Sakura as if viewed through a thick, warped pane of glass. Her body moved on autopilot, one heavy foot in front of the other, guided by muscle memory alone. The weight in her chest was a physical thing, a lodestone of grief and guilt that made each step an effort. The cool night air did nothing to cleanse the smell of antiseptic and blood that seemed woven into her clothes and skin. Kakashi's order had been firm, brooking no argument. "You are no good to him collapsing from exhaustion, Sakura. You need to rest." Your parents will be worried. Go home. His loan I had held not the usual lazy indifference, but a commander's steel, and beneath it, a flicker of shared, weary understanding. He would stand watch over the impossible boy in the sterile room. That was his burden. Hers, for now, was to survive the return to a normalcy that no longer existed. She finally stood before the familiar, modest house with its well-tended flower boxes. The light in the front window was a warm, yellow square against the deep blue of the night. It felt alien, a beacon from a life that belonged to someone else. She pushed the door open. The reaction was immediate. A gasp, the sound of a chair scraping back, and then her mother, Kizashi, was upon her. "Sakura, oh, my baby, we heard there was trouble. We were so worried." Her words were a torrent of relief and anxiety as she engulfed Sakura in a tight, smothering embrace. The scent of her mother's perfume, usually comforting, was cloying. The warmth of the hug felt constricting, a demand for an emotional response Sakura could not give. Sakura stood rigid within the circle of her mother's arms. She did not lift her own to return the hug. She did not bury her face in her mother's shoulder. She was a statue, carved from cold marble and exhaustion. The onslaught of maternal concern was a distant noise, like the market chatter earlier. "Sakura," her mother pulled back, her hands on Sakura's shoulders, her eyes scanning her daughter's face. The dried tear tracks, the dirt smudges, the hollow, shadowed-looking eyes that usually held such fierce focus. "What's wrong? What happened? Where are your teammates?" The questions were needles. Teammates, plural, a unit of 3, now a fragment. The first tear escaped, a hot, singular track down her temple and into her hairline. Then another, and another. They came not in loud, heaving sobs, but in a silent, relentless flood, soaking her pillow without a sound. Her body shook with the effort of containing the noise, but the tears themselves were a silent confession of absolute despair. "Sakura," her mind whispered to the weeping girl in the dark, "if only I could have." The sentence hung unfinished. What could she have done? Thrown a kunai? Screamed a warning she was too paralyzed to voice? Stepped in front of the Simban herself? The scenarios were pathetic, childish fantasies. The reality was her own stark, unvarnished inadequacy. She had trained for years, memorized every theory, aced every written exam. She could identify 100 pressure points and describe the chemical composition of 36 poisons. But when the mist descended and the ice formed, her knowledge was a library locked in a burning building. Useless. She had no words for the feeling. It was too vast, too consuming. It was the collapse of her entire identity. The smart one, the one who would support Sasuke-kun, the kunoichi who would prove that brains mattered. That identity lay in pieces, crushed under the weight of Zabuza's sword and Haku's needles. Downstairs, in the living room washed in the dim light of a single lamp, the silence was broken. Mabuki had finally cried herself to an exhausted sleep on the couch, her head in her husband's lap. Kizashi stroked her hair, his own face lined with worry, staring blankly at the wall. Then he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, the soft, rhythmic creak of the bed frame from the room above. It was a sound he knew from her infancy, the sound of small, distressed movements. And beneath it, carried by the quiet house like a mournful secret through the floorboards, the sound of weeping. Not loud, dramatic crying, but the choked, guttural, utterly hopeless sound of a soul breaking apart. He closed his eyes, a fresh wave of helpless pain washing over him. He could no more fix this than he could stop the rain. This was shinobi pain. This was the price their village, their world extracted. His little girl, who had left the house days ago with a spring in her step and a team to join, had returned a veteran of a private war, and she was grieving her fallen comrade alone in the dark. He held his sleeping wife tighter, listening to the silent weeping turned audible that seeped from the ceiling, a sorrowful lullaby for the death of innocence, and the brutal, tear-soaked birth of a resolve that would, from this night forward, be forged not in books, but in blood and regret. Visions in blood. In the sterile, dimly lit recovery room, Uzumaki Naruto existed in a liminal space. Powerful sedatives held his body in a vice-like calm, but his mind, fueled by the Uzumaki's formidable life force and the freshly grafted chakra pathways now threaded through another's eyes, was a storm-tossed sea. He did not dream. He relived. The world dissolved from the abstract darkness behind his bandages into a different, sharper darkness, a cool, moonlit night in Konoha. But the perspective was wrong. He was shorter. The world was seen from a height that was not his own. The sensations were alien. The familiar yet strange weight of his own body, the feel of a high-collared shirt against his neck, the subtle, ingrained arrogance in his own posture. He was Sasuke. He was running home, late from the academy, a flicker of annoyance at being held up by meaningless drills. The Uchiha compound gates loomed, imposing and familiar. But the silence was wrong. It was a profound, swallowing void where there should have been the sounds of life. Arguments from the police force headquarters, laughter from homes, the clatter of a distant practice session. The only sound was the rustle of leaves in the wind, a sound that now felt like a whisper of doom. The first body was just inside the gate. A clansman Naruto didn't know, sprawled on the manicured path, eyes staring at a moon they could no longer see. The scent hit him then, not the imagined scent of the hospital antiseptic, but the real, coppery, thick reek of blood, so potent it coated the back of his throat. In his, Sasuke's, chest, a cold dread began to crystallize. He ran, his sandals slapping against the stone, the panic alive wire in his veins. Body after body, men, women, familiar faces from the market, stern officers, a kindly aunt who once gave him dango. All still, all empty. The intricate Uchiha fan symbols on their backs were stained dark. The beautiful compound, a symbol of pride and power, had become an open-air tomb. Naruto Sasuke's breath came in ragged, childish gasps, the logical part of the mind shutting down, leaving only primal, escalating terror. Then, the house. His home. The shoji screen was torn. He pushed it open, the wooden frame slick under his small, trembling hands. The scene inside was a masterpiece of horror. His parents, Fugaku and Mikoto, were arranged as if in repose before the family altar. But the pools of blood beneath them told the true story. And standing over them, backlit by the moonlight streaming through the broken screen, was Itachi. Naruto Sasuke's mind shattered. The figure of his adored, invincible older brother was now a monolith of nightmare. The familiar face was a mask of absolute, chilling calm. The eyes were different, not the gentle, tired eyes Sasuke remembered, but a spinning, monstrous red pattern. The Mangekyo Sharingan, a shape of violence given form. Itachi Nizan? The voice that came out was Sasuke's, small, broken, pleading. It was a child's last hope that this was a trick, a genjutsu, anything but reality. Itachi turned. The gaze that fell upon him was not brotherly. It was the gaze of a scientist observing an insect. Sasuke, the voice was flat, devoid of all the warmth it once held. You are too weak to understand. The explanation that followed was a scalpel flaying a child's soul. Itachi spoke of the clan's planned coup, of his own role as a double agent, of the test of his own capacity. He spoke of measuring his capacity, the words clinical and horrifying. To Naruto, witnessing it through Sasuke's senses, it was an incomprehensible madness. This wasn't a battle, a fight between shinobi. This was slaughter, a genocide conducted by one of their own. Why? Sasuke's voice was a whimper. Mother, father, to test my capacity, Itachi repeated, as if explaining a simple math problem. And for you, my foolish little brother, I have a special gift. The world twisted. The familiar living room fell away, replaced by an infinite, gray void. The moon hung, massive and blood-red, in a starless sky. Naruto Sasuke was paralyzed, bound to a wooden post. Time lost all meaning. Itachi stood before him, and the killing began. It was the Tsukuyomi. For 72 hours of condensed, subjective torment, Naruto experienced it. Not as an observer, but as Sasuke. He felt the kunai pierce Sasuke's flesh, not once, but thousands upon thousands of times. Each thrust was meticulously executed, each burst of agony unique and exquisite. He saw his parents die again and again, from every angle, each death slower, more detailed than the last. He felt his mind, a child's mind, being systematically shredded, each memory of love and safety overwritten with the image of Itachi's impassive face and the glint of the blade. The pain was not just physical. It was the utter destruction of reality, of trust, of love. It was the absolute, helpless certainty that the person he had loved and admired most in the world was a monster, and that he, Sasuke, was too insignificant, too weak, to even be killed properly, only tortured for the crime of existing. Naruto screamed within the vision, but no sound came out. He raged, the Kyuubi's chakra boiling somewhere in the distant core of his own being, but it was useless here. This was a memory, a psychic wound etched into the very optic nerves now connected to his brain. He was forced to feel every second of Sasuke's despair, his betrayal, his shattered love curdling into all-consuming hatred. The vision finally broke, snapping back to the bloody living room. Sasuke was on his knees, tears and slick trails of terror and madness on his face. Itachi's final words were a curse disguised as a blessing. If you wish to kill me, hate me, detest me, and survive in an unsightly way, run, cling to your pitiful life. And then, the finger to the forehead, a mocking, terrible echo of a once gentle gesture. Farewell, Sasuke. The memory fractured into static, then into the screams of a broken boy running endlessly through a compound of the dead, the sound echoing into nothingness. In the hospital bed, Naruto's body went rigid. Under the fresh bandages, his new eyes, Sasuke's eyes, jerked and darted beneath their lids, as if trying to follow the fleeing figure of a traumatized child. A low, agonized moan escaped his lips, a sound that held not just physical pain, but the echo of a mass murder and a mental torture that had just become his inheritance. He had seen it, he had felt it, the cold of the night, the warmth of the blood, the unimaginable pain of the Tsukuyomi, the absolute vacuum where a brother's love had been. Sasuke's last command, kill Itachi, was no longer just a request from a dying friend. It was a mandate seared into Naruto's very consciousness, a debt of vengeance witnessed firsthand. He now understood the scale of the hatred that had fueled Sasuke, the depth of the darkness that had lived behind those onyx eyes. And that darkness was now a part of him, grafted as surely as the corneas and retinas. The vision faded, leaving him trembling in the real darkness of his bandages, the ghost scent of blood and the phantom screams of a clan echoing in the silent room. He finally understood the true weight of the eyes he now carried. They were not just organs of sight. They were repositories of a massacre, windows into a hell that he, Uzumaki Naruto, was now sworn by Brotherhood to avenge. The sterile darkness behind the bandages had become a canvas for visions of blood and betrayal. The phantom screams of a massacred clan had finally faded, leaving in their wake a cold, clear emptiness. Naruto lay still on the hospital bed, the beep of the monitor a steady, mundane counterpoint to the seismic shift within his soul. The echo of Sasuke's pain, the loneliness, the betrayal, the all-consuming hatred, had been a torrent, threatening to drown Naruto's own identity. But Uzumaki Naruto was not made to drown. He was made to endure, to push back, to rise. In the quiet aftermath of the shared nightmare, a new resolve began to crystallize, hard and sharp as a diamond forged under impossible pressure. Brother. The word, now his to claim, echoed in the private theater of his mind. Your pain, it's not similar to mine. Mine was being ignored, hated for something I didn't choose. Yours was... He flinched inwardly from the memory of the Tsukuyomi. Yours was being loved, then having that love used to destroy you. But you were alone, like me. A profound, aching kinship settled over him, deeper than any rivalry or friendship had ever been. They had been mirrors, one reflecting outward rejection, the other inward annihilation. Both alone in crowded rooms, one a village pariah, the other the sole survivor of a family tomb. Unlike me, you left this world early, but I'll make sure your dream is fulfilled. The promise was not a shout. It was a vow, spoken silently into the void, with the weight of a blood oath. It anchored him. Sasuke's ambition, vengeance against Itachi, was now a compass point in Naruto's world. His own dream, to become Hokage, to be acknowledged by all, was not discarded. It was fused with it, creating a new, harder path, to become Hokage and avenge Sasuke, to protect the village that birthed them both and destroy the monster it had created in Itachi. The contradictions would tear a lesser person apart. For Naruto, they became the twin pillars of his purpose. A strange, dry calm washed over him. The tears he had shed on the bridge, the silent weeping in the wagon, they felt like the last vestiges of a softer self. That boy, the one who cried and shouted and begged for attention, had died with Sasuke on that bridge. From now on, he thought, the resolution ironclad. No more crying, not until I achieve my dream and your ambition. The path forward was terrifyingly clear. The playful rivalries, the lazy days, the goofing off to get a reaction. All of that was a luxury of the past, a memory of a boy who still had time. He had no time now. He had a brother's ghost to appease and a demon's power to master. I'll have to get stronger. Stop fooling around. The self-assessment was brutally honest. His fights in Wave had been a mess of instinct and borrowed power. That wouldn't suffice. Not against what was coming. Force Kakashi-sensei to... He paused, a faint, ghostly impression of Sasuke's perpetual scoff flickering in his mind. All right. He mentally conceded to the memory. You never called him sensei. A sound escaped him, a short, dry breath of air that was the ghost of a chuckle. It held no humor, only a stark acknowledgement of their differences. Even in this, Sasuke's pride was a lesson. Respect had to be earned, not given with a title. Force Kakashi-sensei to train me. Really train me. No more basic tree walking while he reads his stupid book. I need to learn everything. But relying solely on Kakashi was another form of weakness. Sasuke's strength had been self-forged in the fires of his hatred, honed in the Uchiha training grounds long before Team 7. And I will also develop my own skills further, Naruto vowed. The Kyuubi's chakra was a wild, deadly river within him. He had tasted its power, felt it shatter ice and rend flesh. He could no longer fear it, or let it control him in moments of panic. He had to master it, to channel it, to make it his own, just as he would have to master the strange, dormant potential now resting in his eye sockets. He lay in the dark, no longer a patient, but a strategist. The playful, orange-clad genin was gone. In his place was a vessel of determination, holding a demon's fury and a brother's cold, onyx-eyed legacy. The journey of Uzumaki Naruto had taken a sharp, irrevocable turn into shadows he had only just begun to see, and his first step would be to demand the tools to navigate them. Outside the recovery room door, Hatake Kakashi stood as a silent, weary sentinel. His shoulder leaned against the cool plaster of the wall, his head bowed slightly. The familiar, chaotic buzz of Naruto's chakra signature seeped through the door, a turbulent, orange-hued energy that always felt like a sunspot. He could sense it fluctuate, churning with a new, discordant note. It wasn't the violent eruption of the fox's power he'd felt on the bridge. This was subtler, an internal tempest of thought and resolution. The chakra spiked with sharp intent, then smoothed into a hard, determined focus, like molten metal being hammered into a blade. Kakashi's single visible eye closed. He didn't need the Sharingan to understand what was happening in that room. The boy wasn't just healing. He was metamorphosing. The grief, the trauma, the horrific inheritance, they were all being processed not into despair, but into a frightening kind of fuel. He'd seen it before, in the mirror, after he'd lost Obito and Rin. The moment when sadness calcifies into purpose, and that purpose curdles into something darker, harder. He sighed a long, slow exhalation that carried the dust of his own ghosts. There was nothing he could do to stop this particular wheel from turning. He could only try to guide its path, to ensure the blade being forged wasn't turned against the village itself. His thoughts were a grim swirl of Minato-sensei's hopeful face, Obito's gift, and now Sasuke's final bloody bequest. The cycle was relentless. Deep beneath the sunlit streets and cheerful bustle of Konoha, in a network of tunnels that officially no longer existed, the air was still and cold. The only light came from a single, hooded lantern on a heavy oak desk, casting long, grasping shadows on bare stone walls. This was a memorial to a disbanded organization, a ghost office for a ghost commander. Shimura Danzo sat in the pool of lamplight, his posture rigid, the bandages covering his right eye and arm looking like mummified flesh in the gloomy light. Before him, unfurled on the polished wood, was a scroll. Its contents had arrived via a channel that bypassed the Hokage's desk, the ANBU logs, and all official registries. It was a report from a pair of eyes that still saw for him, even if the body they belonged to now wore a different insignia. His lone eye, dark and sharp as a flint arrowhead, moved methodically across the lines of coded script. The news from the Land of Waves was laid out with clinical detachment. Team 7's altered mission parameters, the engagement with Zabuza Momochi, the death of the 100 Haku, and the casualties. A faint, thin line that might have been a smile touched his lips as he read the confirmed fate of Uchiha Sasuke. So, he murmured, the word dry as dead leaves. The last loyal Uchiha has fallen. Good. To Danzo, the Uchiha were not a clan. They were a problem of emotion, of volatility, of a dangerous power that threatened the village's delicate, root-like stability from within. Itachi had been a necessary scalpel, but the survival of the youngest had been an unforeseen variable, a potential seed for sentimentality, for inconvenient questions, for a future revival of that dangerous pride. His death in the field was a clean, deniable solution. It prevented future, unnecessary annoyances and actions. It closed a file. He unrolled the scroll further, the parchment whispering against the desk. The next passage made his eye narrow, the pupil contracting to a pinprick. Fatal injury sustained, deliberate ocular transfer performed by subject prior to expiration. Uzumaki recipient currently undergoing graft procedure under Hokage's seal. The Jinchuriki had the eyes. For a long moment, Danzo was perfectly still. Then, a slow, calculating heat began to burn behind his solitary gaze. A disaster had been transformed, in an instant, into an opportunity. The Kyuubi's container was already a weapon of immense, if unstable, potential. But a weapon that could not be aimed was merely a hazard. Those eyes, the Sharingan, were the ultimate tools of perception, of control, of guidance. "This can be salvageable," he breathed, the words barely audible. His mind, a labyrinth of contingency plans and ruthless calculus, began to whir. The boy was injured, vulnerable, drowning in new and conflicting loyalties. He was a piece of driftwood in a storm, ready to be pulled to any shore that offered direction. "If only I could get my hands on the boy," he mused, his bandaged arm, the one that housed a prison of stolen Sharingan, twitching almost imperceptibly. Direct acquisition was impossible now. The Hokage's personal seal was on the procedure. The boy would be under Kakashi's watch, and soon, the entire village's wary gaze. A blunt approach would shatter his fragile, post-genocide credibility. He needed leverage, a point of entry, a weakness that wasn't the boy himself. His eye drifted back to the report, to the other names listed. The third genin, the civilian-born girl. Well, Danzo murmured, the word final. He carefully began to re-roll the scroll, his movements precise. "Let's see what I will come up with." The lantern light guttered as a faint, cold draft snaked through the chamber. Danzo sat in the returning darkness, not as a man mourning a lost genin, but as a strategist observing the sudden, fortuitous rearrangement of pieces on a board only he could see. The Uchiha were gone, but their power lived on, now housed in the village's most potent, most malleable asset. All he needed was the right tool to shape it, and tools, as he knew better than anyone, did not need to be willing. They only needed to be useful. The morning light that filtered through Sakura's window was a pale, indifferent yellow. It fell across her bed, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, but it did not touch the chill that had settled in her bones. She had woken not from rest, but from a fitful half-sleep haunted by ice and blood. The depression was a physical weight, pressing her into the mattress, making the simple act of opening her eyes feel like a monumental effort. She lay there, staring at the ceiling where a faint crack she'd never noticed before seemed to map the fractures in her own spirit. Downstairs, the familiar, comforting sounds of breakfast being prepared, the clatter of plates, the sizzle of eggs, her parents' muted, worried voices drifted up. Each sound felt like an accusation. How could life just continue? How could they make eggs when Sasuke was in a cold room in the morgue and Naruto was bandaged and blind in a hospital? The door creaked open softly. "Sakura? Sweetheart." Her mother, Mabuki, entered, her face a careful mask of concern that couldn't hide the shadows under her own eyes. She carried a tray with toast and tea, the steam curling hopefully in the sunlight. "You need to eat something. You didn't have dinner last night." Sakura didn't turn her head. She gave no sign she'd heard. Her gaze remained fixed on that crack in the ceiling. Mabuki set the tray on the bedside table and sat on the edge of the bed. She reached out, her hand gentle, to brush a strand of pink hair from her daughter's forehead. Sakura flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but it spoke volumes. The mother's touch, once a sanctuary, now felt like an intrusion on her grief. "Come on, Sakura," Mabuki said, her voice adopting a forcibly bright, coaxing tone. It was the voice she used when Sakura was a child, and had scraped her knee. "It's a beautiful day. Let's get you cleaned up. We can go to the market later. Get some of those sweet dumplings you like." Your father said he heard the new shipment of kunoichi theory scrolls arrived at the library. The cheerful litany was like sandpaper on a raw nerve. It was so utterly, devastatingly normal. It denied the reality of the crater that had opened in Sakura's world. Each mention of mundane pleasures felt like a betrayal of Sasuke's memory. "He's gone." Sakura's voice was flat, hollow, cutting through her mother's words like a rusted blade. She still didn't look at her. Mabuki paused, her false cheer faltering. "Who's gone, honey?" "Sasuke." The name erupted from Sakura's throat, a raw, wounded scream. She finally turned, her green eyes blazing with a fury born of absolute despair. "He's gone. He's not in the academy, he's not on a mission, he's not coming back. He's not longer in this world. And it's all my fault. All mine." Tears she thought she'd exhausted the night before sprang anew, hot and furious. She was shaking, her fists clenched so tight her knuckles were white. "I was there. I was right there, and I just watched. I was useless. A stupid, weak, useless little girl who was too scared to move. If I had been stronger, if I had done something, he might still be here." Mabuki stared, stunned into silence by the volcanic eruption of her daughter's guilt. The careful motherly script had no response for this. This was shinobi guilt, a specific corrosive poison she had no antidote for. Instinctively, driven by a need to shock her daughter out of this self-immolating spiral, her hand moved. It wasn't a harsh strike, but it wasn't gentle either. A firm, sharp slap across Sakura's cheek, the sound startlingly loud in the quiet room. Sakura's tirade cut off, her head snapping to the side. She blinked, the physical sensation a bizarre anchor in the storm of her emotions. Then, instead of pulling away, Mabuki surged forward and wrapped her arms around her daughter in a bone-crushing hug. She pulled Sakura's head against her shoulder, one hand cradling the back of her head. "Stop it," she whispered, her own voice breaking. "Just stop it, my brave, foolish girl." The dam broke. Sakura's rigid body went limp. The angry, shouted tears dissolved into deep, shuddering, soul-racking sobs. She cried into her mother's shoulder, the sound muffled by the fabric, all the horror, the fear, the crushing guilt finally finding an outlet that wasn't rage. Her mother held her, rocking slightly, saying nothing, just being an anchor in the tempest. When the worst of the storm had passed in a hiccuping silence, Mabuki spoke, her lips against Sakura's hair. "I can't understand your pain," she admitted, her voice thick. "I'm not a kunoichi. I've never held a kunai or faced an enemy who wanted to kill me. But all I know, with every piece of my mother's heart, is that you couldn't have done nothing that day. You survived. That is doing something. You came home to us. That is everything." The door, which had been left ajar, pushed open further. Kizashi stood there, his quiet presence filling the doorway. He had heard everything. His kind eyes held an ocean of sorrow for his daughter. "And there's nothing you could have predicted," he added, his voice a low, steady rumble. He entered the room, standing beside the bed. "You are a genin, Sakura. On your first mission outside the walls. You faced a missing nin from the Seven Swordsmen. The Hokage himself didn't predict that. Your Jonin sensei was caught off guard. To expect you, a 13-year-old girl, to have changed that outcome, it's not guilt, my dear. It's a cruelty you are inflicting on yourself." Sakura pulled back slightly from her mother's embrace, her face blotchy and exhausted. The words of her parents, logical and loving, lapped against the walls of her conviction, but couldn't quite breach them. The image of her own paralysis was too strong. "I think," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying, "I think I will quit. I'm not. I'm not cut out for this. I'll just get someone else killed. Kazashi's expression didn't change, but his gaze sharpened. He reached out, not to hug her, but to gently grasp her mother's shoulder, pulling Mabuki back to give Sakura space. He looked directly into his daughter's devastated eyes. "No," he said, the words simple and firm, devoid of anger but full of a newfound steel. "What about your other teammate?" Sakura blinked, Naruto's bandaged face swimming into her mind's eye. "Don't take the cowardly way out," Kazashi continued. "And I am not saying wanting to be safe, to leave a life of danger, is a cowardly thing. It is a wise, human thing. But you are not running towards safety, Sakura. You are running from your failure. And if you run now, you leave him alone." He let the image of Naruto, blind and burdened, hang in the air between them. "You could prevent your other teammate from having the same fate, or you could ensure he faces it alone. The choice is yours." His words were a different kind of slap, one of cold, hard truth. They reframed her decision not as an escape, but as an abandonment. It shifted the axis of her guilt from the past to the future. He stepped back, taking Mabuki's hand. "We will let you decide. We are your parents. We will love you if you wear a forehead protector or an apron." He gave her a small, sad, but unwavering smile. "But come down to eat soon. You cannot save anyone, including yourself, on an empty stomach." He led a tearful Mabuki from the room, closing the door softly behind them, leaving Sakura alone once more. But the silence was different now. It wasn't filled just with the echo of her own failure. It was now charged with a choice, the path of the runaway and the path of the protector, and in the hollow of her grief, the first fragile seedling of a new resolve, not to atone for the past, but to change the future, began to painfully push its way toward the light. The silence after her parents left was no longer a vacuum of despair. It was a charged space, humming with the echo of her father's words. "You could prevent your other teammate from having the same fate." They echoed, then merged with another, older memory. Naruto's voice, bright and stubborn, on their first day as a team. "I'm going to be Hokage, believe it." And later, his unflinching, illogical defense of her against the disguised Zabuza on the bridge, his back to her, his stance wide and foolishly brave. She thought of Naruto, not the loud, annoying boy she used to dismiss, but the person she had witnessed on that bridge. The one who had matched Sasuke move for move. The one whose instinctual roar of denial when Sasuke fell had been pure, unadulterated anguish. The one who had, in his own blinding, furious grief, unleashed a power that shattered hell itself. And the one who now lay in a hospital, blind, carrying the eyes and the vengeance of the friend who had been closer to him than anyone. A new, piercing understanding lanced through her. While her world had revolved around Sasuke, Sasuke's world, his rivalry, his grudging respect, his final, desperate trust, had orbited Naruto. Their bond was a closed circuit, a brotherhood forged in conflict and sealed in blood. She had been an outsider to that. Kakashi-sensei, for all his power, was an outsider to that. Naruto had lost not just a teammate, but a mirror, a counterweight, a brother. His pain was a different geography than hers, deeper, more complicated, shadowed by a horrific legacy now physically embedded within him. She couldn't soothe that pain. She couldn't replace what was lost. But a new, fierce thought ignited in the ashes of her old self. He is in the dark now, literally, and the path Sasuke set him on, it's a dark one too. If she couldn't be the object of his bond, she could become something else. His ally, his shield, his light. The thought was almost foreign, a role she had never envisioned for herself. But it fit with a terrible, perfect logic. Sasuke had passed Naruto a legacy of vengeance. She would dedicate herself to ensuring he survived to fulfill it. She would stand between him and the world that wanted to break him, between his own raging power and his self-destruction, between the shadows of the past and the uncertain future. Father is right, she thought, the conviction hardening like cooling steel in her chest. The self-pitying fog burned away, replaced by a clear, cold clarity. Quitting isn't an option. Running is. And she was done running. I will have to become stronger. Not just a little stronger. Not just strong enough to pass a Chunin exam. She needed a metamorphosis. The kind of strength that could stand on a bridge and change the outcome. The kind that could intercept a Senbon, shatter an ice mirror, face a demon of the mist and win. The kind of strength that could stand beside a Jinchuriki bearing a Sharingan and not be blown away by the storm swirling around him. To prevent what happened to Sasuke from happening to Naruto. That was the mission now. Singular. Absolute. Her eyes, still puffy from tears, swept around her room. It was a shrine to her old life. The vanity with its unused hair ribbons and subtle powders meant to impress a boy who would never look. The stacked, pristine theory scrolls, knowledge that had been useless when it mattered. The little decorative knickknacks, symbols of a civilian girl's harmless hobbies. It all seemed like clutter now. Obstacles. I have to leave any other habits behind. The habit of vanity. The habit of passive study. The habit of defining her worth by another's gaze. The habit of being weak. She would strip it all away. Every frivolous thought, every ounce of wasted effort would be purged and converted into fuel for the single, driving purpose that now defined her existence. She swung her legs out of bed, her feet hitting the floor with a solid, final sound. The depression was gone, burned off by the intensity of her new resolve. In its place was a focused, almost frightening calm. She walked to her mirror and met her own gaze. The girl there was pale, eyes rimmed in red, but the vacuous despair was gone. In its depths, a green fire was kindling. "I'll become so strong," she said aloud to her reflection, her voice low and devoid of its usual melodic lilt, now pure, unadorned will. "So strong that nothing will happen to Naruto. No one will take another teammate from me. Ever again." It was a vow, a promise to the ghost of one boy, and a shield for the living heart of another. The kunoichi known as Sakura Haruno, the fangirl, the book-smart genin, was left behind in the tear-soaked pillows of that bed. The person who stood up was something new, something harder, forged in the worst moment of her life, and tempered by a protective fury as vast as it was precise. Her journey to the hospital, to Naruto's side, would no longer be that of a grieving friend. It would be the first patrol of a self-appointed guardian, and her training would no longer be for a career. It would be for a crusade. A few days passed, each one a slow, deliberate etching on Sakura's new resolve. The grief was not gone, but it had been compartmentalized, locked away in a chamber of her heart to be used as kindling for her determination. She had spent the time in a furious, silent routine, grueling physical conditioning in her backyard until her muscles screamed, meditation to quell the lingering panic, and ruthless study of medical texts she'd borrowed from the library. No longer for grades, but for the cold, practical knowledge of how to keep a body alive under trauma. The walk to the hospital that afternoon felt like crossing a border into a past life. The sun was high, casting sharp shadows, a stark contrast to the misty gloom of wave that still clung to her memory. Her pace was measured, her face a careful mask of composure. She had received the terse message from Kakashi. Naruto's grafts have integrated. Bandage removal this afternoon. She had not visited since that first night. It wasn't neglect. She had needed to armor herself first to ensure that when she faced him again, she wouldn't see just the broken boy, but the comrade she had sworn to protect. She found Kakashi already in the room, leaning against the far wall with his usual feigned nonchalance. Though the tension around is visible, I betrayed him. Naruto sat upright on the edge of the bed, dressed in a clean hospital gown, his spiky hair somehow defying even the sterile environment. The thick bandages were still wrapped around his head, a stark white crown. Sakura took her place beside Kakashi, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The doctor, the same stern-faced man from the surgery, entered with a quiet efficiency. "I will start removing the bandages now," he stated, his voice devoid of bedside manner. "All business." Naruto gave a single, firm nod. He had spent days in a world of touch, sound, and memory. The absolute darkness had been his canvas for the nightmares of the Uchiha compound and the grim forge of his new vows. Now he was about to be reborn into the world of light, to see it through lenses that were not his own. "I hope it went well." Kakashi's thought was a silent whisper in his own mind, a rare prayer from a man accustomed to worst-case scenarios. He remembered the violent red of the Kyuubi's chakra, the dormant potential of the Uchiha eyes. The fusion was an unprecedented alchemy. With practiced, gentle movements, the doctor began unwinding the gauze. Layer after layer fell away, revealing the pale skin of Naruto's face, the faint, healed marks where the sunburn had struck. Finally, the last pad came free. Naruto's eyelids remained shut, long lashes casting shadows on his cheeks. "You can open them now," the doctor instructed, stepping back slightly. A collective breath was held. Sakura's nails dug into her palms. Kakashi's eye narrowed to a slit. Slowly, Naruto opened his eyes, and the world saw onyx. Deep, dark, fathomless onyx. The color of a starless night sky, of polished river stones. There was no hint of scarlet, no telltale tomo, not even a faint red tinge. They were Sasuke's eyes in their resting state, perfectly completely. Kakashi's visible eye widened a fraction. A silent shockwave passed through him. What? Sasuke had awakened the Sharingan, the two tomo, during the fight on the bridge. He had seen it himself. The dojutsu should have been active, ingrained in the chakra pathways of the eyes themselves. The transplant should have transferred that potential, that awakened state. This was a biological impossibility. It was as if the eyes had been reset, their traumatic awakening erased, returning to their pristine, pre-Uchiha massacre state. A cold suspicion began to coil in his gut. Was it the overwhelming influence of the Kyuubi's chakra during the integration? Or something about Naruto's own biology rejecting the Uchiha's curse? Sakura's voice, quiet but steady, cut through his spiraling thoughts. "How do you feel?" The doctor, also masking his professional surprise, cleared his throat. "Yes. How do you feel? Can you see?" Naruto blinked. Once, twice, a rapid series of flutters as his brain processed the sudden influx of visual data after days of void. The world rushed in, the sterile white of the walls, the concerned face of the pink-haired girl, the slouched form of his sensei by the wall, the dust motes dancing in a sunbeam. It was overwhelmingly bright, achingly detailed, and it was all filtered through a familiar, yet deeply alien perspective. The color palette felt subtly different, contrast sharper. It was Sasuke's visual acuity, now his. "Yes," he said, his voice slightly rough from disuse. "I can see clearly." Sakura let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, a small sigh of profound relief. The eyes worked. He wasn't blind. That was the first, most crucial victory. Kakashi gave a slow nod. "That's good." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was immense. "Okay, let's have a few tests," the doctor said, his manner returning to clinical efficiency. He left and returned shortly with an eye chart, not of simple letters, but of complex kanji in varying sizes and fonts, a test designed for shinobi who needed to read scrolls and maps at a glance. Read the smallest line you can distinguish, the doctor instructed. Read the smallest line you can distinguish, the doctor instructed. Naruto's new eyes scanned the chart. He read them off, not just correctly, but with a speed and ease that hinted at a perception beyond normal. He aced the session. The graphs were not just taking, they were thriving, offering visual precision that was frankly elite. Satisfied, the doctor made notes and finally nodded. You are discharged. Avoid strenuous chakra use for the remainder of the week. Report any pain, blurred vision, or unusual visual phenomena immediately. Once the doctor was gone, Naruto shifted on the bed. Can you guys wait outside? I need to change. They both nodded and filed out quietly, giving him privacy. In the hallway, the silence between Kakashi and Sakura was heavy with unspoken questions. Kakashi's mind raced through the implications of the dormant Sharingan. Sakura simply felt a fierce, protective gladness. He could see. That was enough for now. A few minutes later, the door opened. Naruto emerged, clad in his familiar bright orange jumpsuit. The vibrant color seemed even more stark against the hospital's whites, and his face, now unobscured, looked older, the set of his jaw firmer, the new darkness of his gaze adding a layer of solemnity to his features. Kakashi looked at them both, his student and his complicated new charge. Now that you're both here, he said as they began walking toward the ward's exit, the sound of their footsteps echoing. I can tell you that from this day, you have 2 weeks off duty. Medical leave. Use it to heal. He didn't elaborate. He didn't offer training or platitudes or explanations. The message was clear. The village was giving them time to process the unprocessable, to come to terms with the new realities of their bodies and their team. With a final, inscrutable glance that lingered on Naruto's eyes, Kakashi turned down a separate corridor and was gone, leaving the 2 genin standing alone in the bustling hospital lobby, blinking in the afternoon light. One seeing the world through a fallen brother's eyes, the other sworn to protect the one who now held them. The afternoon sunlight outside the hospital felt different on Naruto's skin, warmer, more real, after the controlled climate of the recovery room. But as they stepped onto the bustling street, a new kind of tension replaced the sterile quiet. The village moved around them, a river of normalcy they were no longer a part of. Sakura walked beside him, her steps measured. The composure she'd built over the past days felt fragile here, in the open. The need to speak, to confess the guilt that had been festering, became overwhelming. Naruto, she began, her voice tentative, I've been wondering, that day on the bridge, if I had been more useful, if I hadn't just frozen. Things could have been different. Maybe Sasuke-kun. Naruto didn't let her finish. He stopped walking and turned to face her, his new onyx eyes meeting hers with an intensity that was startlingly familiar, yet carried none of Sasuke's cold dismissal. Sakura-chan, he said, his voice lower, more grounded than its usual boisterous pitch. It's not really your fault, and you're not wandering on those lines alone. He started walking again, forcing her to keep pace. I've been lying in that bed, going over every second. What if I'd seen the trap a moment sooner? What if my clone had been faster? What if I hadn't needed saving? He shook his head, a sharp, frustrated gesture. The what-ifs are a dead end. A maze with no exit. It happened. Sasuke made his choice. Now, he clenched his fist at his side. Now I have to get stronger. That's the only path forward. They were moving through the market street now. Whispers trailed them like shadows. People paused in their haggling, their eyes drawn to the pair. The blonde Jinchuriki, back from a mission gone horribly wrong, and the pink-haired girl who was always with the Uchiha boy. The stares were a mixture of morbid curiosity, pity, and the usual underlying suspicion directed at Naruto. But both genin, locked in the gravity of their shared aftermath, were oblivious. The village's judgment was a distant hum compared to the roaring truths being exchanged between them. Sakura felt a lump form in her throat at his blunt absolution. It didn't erase her guilt, but it reframed it. It was a burden they shared, not hers alone to carry. Naruto, she breathed, his name carrying a new weight of respect. I have to achieve a certain new goal of mine, Naruto continued, his gaze fixed on some point in the middle distance, seeing not the vegetable stalls, but a future shaped by blood and brotherhood. And for that, I have to get stronger. A lot stronger. This was her opening. The resolve she had forged in her room solidified into words. I have also made a new resolve, she said, her voice gaining strength, losing its tremble. To get stronger. To support your goal. And to protect your dream of being Hokage. Hokage. The word sparked a complex reaction within him. It was his dream, his son, but it was no longer the simple, shining ideal of a lonely boy seeking validation. Now, it was intertwined with darker threads. I don't just want to be Hokage only, he thought, the vision crystallizing with terrifying clarity as he walked. I want to become powerful, so powerful that I can reform the whole shinobi system for the better. So powerful that no village, no kage, no council of old men will dare go against my will. A will for shinobi with no minimum conflict. For a world where kids aren't sent on missions that get them killed for money, where brothers aren't turned into tools and then monsters. It was a colossal, nearly blasphemous ambition, born from the fusion of his innate desire to fix broken things and the horrific systemic failures Sasuke's memory had exposed. He didn't voice it. The thought was too raw, too immense. It was a seed that needed to grow in darkness before it could be shown to the light. He simply gave a small, acknowledging grunt to her declaration of support. The conversation lapsed into a heavy, companionable silence for a block. Then Sakura, steeling herself, broached the unavoidable. So, tomorrow is Sasuke's funeral. The air seemed to grow colder. Yeah, Naruto replied, the single syllable thick. They announced his death officially yesterday, Sakura added, her voice barely above a murmur. The public notification had been a sterile, painful formality, stripping the tragedy of its personal horror and turning it into village record. Naruto sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry the exhaustion of the past week and the weight of the years to come. He came to a halt at a crossroad. One path led deeper into the village, towards his empty apartment. The other led towards the more civilian-heavy districts, where Sakura lived. I'll see you tomorrow, Sakura-chan, he said, not looking at her, his onyx eyes shadowed. Sakura nodded, a firm, decisive motion. Me too. No goodbye. No take care. Just a mutual acknowledgement of the grim pilgrimage they would make together the next day. They parted ways at the crossroads, two figures moving in different directions, each carrying a piece of the same shattered legacy, each now bound by a silent, ironclad pact to forge something new from the ruins. One to fulfill a vengeful promise and build a new world from atop the Hokage's seat, the other to become the unbreakable shield that would ensure he lived to see it. The village's whispers faded behind them, unimportant. The real conversation, the one that would define their lives, had already been held in the quiet space between their words. The silence in Naruto's apartment after the funeral was a living thing. It was heavier than the hospital's quiet, denser than the murmured prayers at the Uchiha's solitary graveside, a sight visited by few and mourned by even fewer. The lingering scent of incense from the ceremony seemed to have followed him home, mixing unpleasantly with the faint, ever-present smell of instant ramen. He stood in the middle of the single room, the echoes of somber drums and Sakura's quiet weeping still ringing in his ears, now filtered through the strange, sharp clarity of Sasuke's eyes. Action was the only antidote to the hollow feeling. He couldn't stand still. With a determined grimace, he pulled a blank scroll from a drawer and unrolled it on his small, cluttered table. He needed to see the battlefield of his own inadequacy laid bare. He needed a map if he was to navigate the path to the power he now desperately required. Taking a brush, its tip black with fresh ink, he began to write. The characters were deliberate, a stark contrast to his usual haphazard scrawl. Things I am lacking asterisk. He started with the most obvious, the most personally galling, basic taijutsu. He paused, the brush hovering. A memory flashed. Sasuke moving with fluid, economical grace during their bell test, effortlessly dodging his clumsy charges. I know I am lacking in it, he muttered aloud, the sound too loud in the empty room. Even though I tried to hide it with tricks and clones, Sasuke always beat me in it. He wrote it down. The admission stung, but truth was the first step. Genjutsu. He scowled at the word. This was a vast, terrifying blank spot in his knowledge. He'd heard the theory, but the idea of manipulating an opponent's senses was as abstract as star navigation to him. I have no idea about this particular ninja art, he confessed to the scroll, the admission of ignorance another brick in the wall of his resolve. Shuriken Jutsu. A slight frown. I think I'm better, but needs refining. He remembered Haku's needles, their impossible speed and accuracy. His own thrown weapons were serviceable, but they lacked the pinpoint, fight-ending precision of a true master. He added it to the list. He tapped the brush against the inkstone, thinking, ninjutsu. He wrote it. Then beneath it, shadow clone, I have it. A flicker of pride, quickly extinguished. And Academy 3, the replacement, transformation and clone techniques. He could do them, but were they combat ready? Were they anything more than childish tricks now? He left it as a question mark. The next line was a verdict on his entire shinobi education to date. Nothing else. He leaned back, staring at the damning list. The words seemed to pulse on the page. How pathetic. The whisper was not one of self-pity, but of cold, factual assessment. This was the arsenal of the boy who had vowed to kill Itachi Uchiha and become Hokage. It was a joke. He bent back to the scroll. What else? Oh, a weapon of my own. Sasuke had his kunai and shuriken, his katan. The image of Zabuza's monstrous sword, Kubikurabocho, filled his mind. Raw, overwhelming power. Something that suited his style, not Sasuke's finesse. But what? I'll come back to this one. He added it as an open question. Then came the crippling reality. He set the brush down. The problem is, how do I go about this? He looked around the barren apartment. I don't have a scroll or anything on the problems I have now. Nor do I have a teacher. Kakashi had given them 2 weeks. 2 weeks to heal, to grieve. But for Naruto, standing still was a form of dying. In the 2 weeks I've got, a wave of profound disappointment, deeper than any he'd felt from the village, washed over him. It was disappointment in himself. The gap between his towering new goals and his meager abilities yawned like a chasm. He had the eyes of an avenger and the heart of a Hokage, but the skills of a barely passable genin. His fist clenched on the tabletop, knuckles white. Just what can I do? The frustration crested, then broke against a simple, stubborn logic. He couldn't fix what he didn't understand, but he could start with what he did understand. He could hone the single sharp tool in his rusted kit. Oh, he said, the sound a release of tension. I'll start with what I can do. Shuriken Jutsu. Decision made, the oppressive stagnation shattered. He stood up so quickly the chair scraped back. He rolled the scroll tightly, a blueprint for his future transformation, and placed it carefully in a drawer. The act of planning had been the first training. He moved to his room, the funeral's black attire feeling like a shroud. He shed it, exchanging it for his familiar orange pants. He pulled on a simple, dark shirt but left the bright orange jacket hanging in the closet. The vibrant color felt wrong, a costume for a cheerful boy who no longer existed. He attached his weapons pouch to his leg, the weight of the kunai and shuriken inside a comforting promise of work to be done. Without a backward glance at the silent, lonely apartment, Uzumaki Naruto stepped out into the twilight. His destination was clear: Training Ground 7, the place where Team 7 had begun. It was a haunted ground now, forever marked by Sasuke's disdain, Sakura's disinterest, and Kakashi's indifference. But it was also his ground, and tonight, he would begin the long, arduous process of forging the pathetic list on that scroll into the skills of a legend. The first strikes of his new life would not be against an enemy, but against the stationary targets of a familiar training field, under the watchful, onyx eyes of his fallen brother. The walk to Training Ground 7 was a journey through a village that felt both familiar and alien. The fading evening light painted the streets in long, melancholy shadows. Naruto moved with a slow, deliberate pace, his head bowed not in the old, defensive slouch of the hated orphan, but with the focused inward gaze of a strategist surveying a barren landscape. The usual boisterous energy that radiated from him was gone, replaced by a dense, contemplative silence. Villagers who glanced his way saw only the top of his spiky blonde head and the uncharacteristic solemnity of his posture, and quickly looked away, the usual scorn tempered by a vague, uncomprehending unease. He didn't see them. His mind was a whirlwind, orbiting the stark list on the scroll he'd left behind. Taijutsu, Genjutsu, Ninjutsu. The words were like empty slots, and he had nothing to fill them with. The memory of Sasuke's effortless skill in each of these areas was a silent, mocking critique. But beneath the self-reproach, a stubborn fire was being banked. He would fill those slots. He would forge the tools himself if he had to. The familiar wooden arch marking Training Ground 7 came into view. The clearing was empty, bathed in the deep blue of approaching night. The log where they'd once sat tied up, the tree where Kakashi had lounged reading. They were just set pieces now in a play that had ended in tragedy. The air here was different from his apartment. It was charged with memory, both bitter and motivational. He walked to the center of the clearing, the grass rustling softly under his feet. With a quiet sigh, he knelt and unbuckled his weapon's pouch, setting it on the ground with a soft thump. The sound was a starting pistol. His new eyes, their onyx depths taking in the dimming light with preternatural clarity, scanned the edge of the clearing. He selected a tall, broad-trunked tree, its bark scarred from past, less focused training sessions. From his pouch, he pulled a single kunai, not to throw, yet. He approached the tree and, with careful, measured strokes, began to carve. The blade bit into the wood, sending curls of pale sapwood to the ground. He didn't carve a bullseye or a simple circle. He carved 3 lines, forming a rudimentary, inverted triangle, the simplest representation of a head and torso. Then, within that triangle, he etched 2 smaller circles for eyes and a slash for a mouth. It was a basic, faceless human silhouette. But to Naruto, it wasn't just a target. In the gloom, the simplistic face seemed to watch him. It was every enemy who had ever looked down on him. It was the sneering visage of Mizuki, the impassive mask of Haku, the cold, superior gaze of others. It was a stand-in for the monumental challenges ahead. He stepped back, 20 paces, his boots scraping on the dirt. The distance was respectful, challenging. The figure was a dark smudge against the darker bark. He reached into his pouch, his fingers closing around the cool, ridged metal of a standard-issue shuriken. He hefted it, feeling its balanced weight. This was step 1. Refinement. Control. He could spam 1,000 shadow clones, but that was brute force. Sasuke's attacks had been surgical. Naruto needed to be both a hurricane and a scalpel. He took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling his lungs. His world narrowed to the line between his hand and the faceless head on the tree. The profound disappointment, the grief, the towering ambition. He funneled it all into this single, simple act. His arm drew back, muscles coiling not with wild energy, but with a focused, unfamiliar precision. For the first time in his life, Uzumaki Naruto was not throwing a shuriken to be loud or to annoy. He was throwing it to change something, to carve a new path one precise strike at a time. The shuriken left his fingers with a sharp hiss, a silver blur cutting through the twilight. It struck the tree with a solid thunk, a hand's breadth left of the carved head. He didn't curse. He didn't shout. His new, dark eyes merely observed the point of impact, calculating the correction. He reached for another shuriken. The night deepened around him. But in Training Ground 7, the quiet, repetitive thunk of metal onward became a determined heartbeat, the sound of a legacy being honed in the dark. The repetitive thunk of shuriken against what had slowed to a discouraged stop. Naruto sat slumped at the base of a tree, his back against the rough bark, staring up at the full moon as it climbed the velvet sky. Its cold, sterile light did nothing to illuminate the path forward, only highlighting the vast gulf between his determination and his skill. The makeshift target on the distant tree was peppered with marks, but few were clustered in the vital areas he'd carved. A profound, weary disappointment settled in his bones, heavier than any fatigue. He had vowed to change, to become a weapon, and on his first night, he'd barely managed to sharpen the point of a pin. His new eyes, perfect in their sight, felt like a mockery. He saw his failure with excruciating clarity. Exhaustion, both physical and emotional, finally overwhelmed his stubborn will. His head nodded, his chin touching his chest, and the moonlit clearing blurred into darkness. But it was not true sleep. It was a descent into a space that was neither dream nor reality, a liminal world built from shared chakra and lingering will. The darkness behind his eyelids resolved into a featureless gray plain under the same cold moonlight. "You really are trying, Dobe." The voice was dry, familiar, and laced with a tired amusement that cut through the fog of Naruto's subconscious. He jolted upright in the non-space. What? Sasuke? Before him, not as a solid body, but as a shimmering, translucent figure woven from pale blue chakra, stood Uchiha Sasuke. His arms were crossed, his expression the usual aloof mask, but his eyes held a faint, sad clarity. "Yes," the spectral Sasuke said, "but this form, it's only the leftover chakra in my eyes. My consciousness, imprinted by my final act. As soon as I knew I was beyond saving, I didn't fight the pull. I gathered every shred of chakra I had left, all of it, and sealed it into my eyes. A final technique." Naruto's mind, even in this dream state, made the connection. So that's why the eyes were black. Not the Sharingan. "Yes," Sasuke confirmed, a ghost of his old smirk touching his lips. "It's amazing what one can think of on their deathbed. A chakra seal to preserve a will. However, the chakra that is holding this echo of my spirit, it's running out. But the reservoir sealed within the eyes themselves is plenty. As soon as you activate the Sharingan, the seal will break. It will disperse into your body and mix with yours." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "Changing your chakra completely." Naruto tried to process the monumental implication. Sasuke, I have to ask you. There's no time, Sasuke interrupted, his form beginning to flicker, edges dissolving into motes of light. So with that said, I'll use what's left of this to imprint all the jutsu and techniques I know. Consider it my final training. He uncrossed his arms, raising a shimmering hand. Take care of Team 7. It's your responsibility now, brother. Wait, Naruto cried, reaching out. But Sasuke was already dissolving. In his final moment, the spectral figure offered not a smile of solace, but the sharp, challenging smirk that was uniquely his, a look that promised a rivalry even beyond the grave. Then, he burst into a silent supernova of blue chakra. The energy did not attack. It flooded into Naruto. It was not just information, but experience. The precise muscle memory of the great fireball jutsu. The feel of the hand seals, the expansion of the lungs, the specific chakra pathway flare. The intricate patterns of the phoenix flower jutsu. The refined, economical angles of advanced shuriken jutsu burned into his brain through the 1,000-hour repetitions of the Uchiha air. And the taijutsu, the fluid, intercepting style of the Sharingan user, a dance of offense and defense meant to create openings for a finishing blow. It was a lifetime of disciplined Uchiha training, compressed into a single, overwhelming instant. Naruto's eyes snapped open in the real world. But they were no longer pools of simple onyx. Swirling within each, vivid and alive against the deep red scara, were twin Tomo, the Sharingan. It was active, not from trauma or hatred, but from the fulfillment of a donor's will and the unlocking of a sealed legacy. The world was not just clear, it was deconstructed. He could see the individual fibers on a leaf 20 yards away, track the lazy flight of a moth as if it were suspended in honey, perceive the faintest thermal gradient in the night air. He looked down at his own hands, seeing the minute flow of chakra within his tenketsu points with terrifying clarity. Sasuke, he breathed, the name an acknowledgement of the gift and its cost. He stood, his movements feeling different, more assured. He bent and picked up a single, discarded shuriken from the grass. He didn't think. He didn't aim. He simply knew. His body moved with an unfamiliar, inherited grace. His wrist flicked. Thwip. Thunk. The shuriken was buried dead center in the left eye of the crude target, the impact shuddering the tree. A fierce, quiet focus gripped him. He reached into his pouch and pulled a handful of shuriken. One after another, in a rapid, seamless rhythm, his arm became a blur. Thwip, 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 thwip. The sounds were a staccato burst of lethal music. Each star found a mark. The other eye, the throat, the heart, joints, transforming the silhouette into a pincushion of perfect, deadly accuracy. He didn't celebrate. He lowered his hand, the Sharingan still spinning slowly, taking in his work. The techniques were now his. The knowledge was integrated, and something deeper was changing. As Sasuke had promised, the vast reservoir of Uchiha chakra, cool, precise, and spiritually potent, heavy, was now seeping from the unlocked eyes, flowing into his system and merging with his own immense, wild, physically robust yang, heavy Uzumaki chakra. The two opposing energies didn't clash. They began to weave together, creating a new, denser, more potent whole. His already formidable chakra capacity expanded, the walls of his internal reservoir reinforcing and stretching. The signature of his chakra, once a blazing, orange-hued beacon of pure life force, began to shift. It grew darker, deeper, like sunlight filtering through ancient water. It gained weight and gravity. It was no longer just powerful. It was becoming profound. The perfect, balanced mixture of yin and yang. The foundational requirement for the most supreme ninjutsu was being forged within him, not through study, but through a brother's final, desperate bequest. Under the moonlight, Uzumaki Naruto stood alone, his Sharingan casting the world in shades of red and hyperdetail. He was no longer just a boy with a demon and a dream. He was now the inheritor of a massacre, the bearer of a bloodline, and the vessel of a chakra transformation that would alter the very nature of his power. The path ahead remained shrouded, but for the first time, he could truly see the first few steps, and they were etched in the perfect, deadly pattern of shuriken on a tree. The sight of the perfectly struck target was not a triumph, but a confirmation. The power was there, sleeping in his muscles, etched into his neural pathways, swirling in his newly awakened eyes. It was a borrowed strength, an inherited will, and Naruto understood instinctively that to truly make it his own, he had to break it in, to sweat and bleed for it until it responded to his spirit, not just Sasuke's memory. He looked at his hands, then at the dozens of shadow clones still milling about the training ground from his earlier, frustrated attempts at shuriken practice. A new, more dangerous idea formed. He couldn't just practice with the new knowledge. He had to be tested against it. He gathered his chakra, the newly dense and potent energy flowing with a startlingly smooth control. With a series of sharp pops, the clearing filled with copies of himself. 20, 30, then 50 Narutos stood in the moonlit grass, all looking at the original with expectant, identical faces. "All right, listen up," the original Naruto called out, his voice carrying a new, commanding edge. The red gleam of the Sharingan made his expression severe. "You're all coming at me. Taijutsu only. No weapons." And, he added, the most crucial rule: you will not use the Sharingan. You fight with what we knew yesterday. Got it? The clones, extensions of his own will, understood perfectly. They grinned. Not the old, goofy grins, but sharp, challenging smirks. They were his past self, his unrefined, brawling spirit, and they were now the perfect sparring partners to test the refined, deadly art now residing within him. The original Naruto took a deep breath, centering himself. He didn't adopt his usual wild, hands out, center of gravity low stance. Instead, his feet slid apart into a balanced, ready position, knees slightly bent, one foot forward, hands coming up to guard his center line. It was a stance of economy and interception, not overwhelming force. It felt foreign, yet the muscle memory from Sasuke's imprint made it feel paradoxically natural. "I will have to master your power first, brother," he whispered, the words lost in the rustle of 50 bodies preparing to charge. "Then I can move on to the next things." He didn't wait for them. With a shout, he launched himself forward, not at the mass, but at a clone on the edge. The clone reacted as he would have: a wide, powerful haymaker. Naruto's Sharingan tracked it effortlessly. He didn't block it head-on. He shifted his weight a fraction, his own hand coming up to slap the punch aside at the wrist, deflecting its force, while his other hand shot forward in a straight, piston-like jab to the clone's solar plexus. Poof! The clone vanished in a cloud of smoke. The movement had been clean, efficient, using the clone's own momentum against it. Two more were on him immediately. He ducked under a high kick, sensing rather than fully seeing the low sweep that followed. The inherited taijutsu style was a dance of perception and minimal movement. He hopped over the sweep, and in midair, twisted his body, lashing out with a heel that caught one clone in the temple. Poof! As he landed, he used the impact to pivot, driving an elbow into the ribs of the second. Poof! But they kept coming, a wave of orange and determination. He was soon surrounded. Punches and kicks came from all angles. The Sharingan spun, processing it all, showing him the trajectories like glowing lines in the air. But knowing the path and his body being able to walk it were two different things. A fist he deflected grazed his cheek. A kick he dodged clipped his thigh. He was fast, but he wasn't perfect. The clones were him. They were unpredictable, stubborn, and fought with the chaotic, never-say-die spirit he was famous for. They didn't fight like Sasuke. They fought like Naruto. And fighting himself was the hardest battle of all. He grunted, taking a solid hit to the shoulder that numbed his arm. He responded not with a roar, but with a gritted teeth focus. He began to chain movements, a parry into a wrist lock, a disarm into a throwing technique he'd never consciously learned. He was a sculptor, and the clones were the raw marble being chipped away with increasingly precise blows. Sweat poured down his face, mixing with the dirt. His breath came in ragged gasps, but his Sharingan never wavered, and his movements, while growing fatigued, grew less imitation and more integration. He started to blend the new style with his own innate tendencies, adding a burst of unexpected, wild aggression after a series of precise blocks, using a clone as a springboard in a move that was pure, acrobatic Naruto, but landing in Sasuke's poised stance. One by one, the clones fell, not to overwhelming power, but to a growing, terrifying efficiency. He was learning to read the Naruto pattern of attack through Sasuke's eyes and counter it with a hybrid style that was uniquely becoming his own. Finally, the last clone stood before him, panting heavily. They circled each other under the moon, two halves of the same whole. With a final, simultaneous cry, they charged. The clone went for a tackle. Naruto didn't retreat. He stepped into it, his hands coming up to guide the clone's momentum past him, while his foot hooked behind the clone's ankle. Using the clone's own charge, he executed a flawless, flowing throw, sending it crashing to the ground before delivering a decisive, open-palmed strike. Poof! Silence. Naruto stood alone in the center of the clearing, chest heaving, his clothes torn and smudged with dirt. The Sharingan slowly faded, the tomo dissolving until his eyes were once again deep, soulful onyx. But they now held the ghost of that red luminescence in their depths, a permanent echo. He looked at his trembling, bruised hands. They were his hands. The style he'd used was becoming his style. The pain was his pain. The victory, however small, was his victory. He had taken the first, brutal step in wrestling a ghost's legacy into the realm of the living. He had begun to master it, and as the cool night air washed over his heated skin, he knew this was only the foundation. The list on the scroll was long, but for the first time, it did not seem insurmountable. The crimson light of the Sharingan winked out, not with a dramatic fade, but with a conscious, deliberate cessation. Naruto focused inward, visualizing the flow of the newly complex chakra, his own vibrant, solar energy now threaded through with Sasuke's cooler, lunar current. He didn't just cut the supply. He gently persuaded the specific pattern that activated the dojutsu to unravel, to settle back into the latent potential nestled within his optic nerves. The world, once hyper-defined and threaded with predictive lines, softened into normal night vision. The transition was smooth, controlled. He murmured to the empty clearing, his voice a low rumble of assessment. Not like Kakashi-sensei's, He'd seen Kakashi's Sharingan flicker on and off, sometimes seeming like a strain, a borrowed power with a cost. This felt different. It felt integrated, like a muscle he'd discovered, sore from its first real use, but fundamentally a part of him. It responded not to trauma, but to his will. The seal Sasuke had placed had not just preserved knowledge. It had engineered a seamless graft. The profound exhaustion of the night's work settled into his bones, a good, clean ache that spoke of progress rather than despair. He gathered his pouch, giving one last look at the tree target. now a testament to both his failure and his sudden, inherited proficiency. The moon was high, casting long, silent shadows. The walk back through the sleeping village was a study in contrast to his earlier journey. His pace was still measured, but the inward-focused tension had eased into a weary resolve. The streets were deserted, the windows dark. The strange looks and whispered judgments were absent, leaving only the quiet intimacy of the night and the echo of his own footsteps on the cobblestones. He didn't look down now. His onyx eyes, dark and deep in the gloom, scanned his surroundings with a new, unconscious vigilance, missing nothing. The shift of a curtain, the scuttle of a night creature, the pattern of the shadows. It was Sasuke's habitual awareness, now underpinning his own. He arrived at his apartment building, its familiar, slightly dilapidated silhouette a welcome sight. The climb up the stairs was automatic. He unlocked his door and stepped into the enveloping silence of his small home. The scroll still lay in the drawer, its list of deficiencies now accompanied by the phantom sensation of mastered movements and the afterimage of spinning tomo. He didn't make ramen. He didn't crash onto the bed. He stood for a moment in the center of the room, simply feeling the quiet thrum of the new chakra mixture within him, a denser, heavier presence than before, like his spirit had gained mass. The disappointment from earlier was gone, burned away in the crucible of combat against himself. With a final, slow exhale, he moved to the washroom to clean the grime of training from his skin. The boy who had left this apartment hours ago, drowning in frustration, did not return. The one who came back carried the quiet certainty of a first hurdle cleared, and the heavy, solemn responsibility of a power that was finally, truly beginning to awaken. He had gone to the training ground with nothing but his own weak resolve. He had returned with the first true tools of his brother's legacy, now waiting in his hands and in his eyes, ready to be forged into something the world had never seen. The 2 weeks of leave stretched before him, not as an empty void of grief, but as a forge waiting to be fired. And tomorrow it would begin in earnest,